Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, the Nika Fanfics. Back with amazing fanfiction. This is the series of What If Deku Awaken Sentient Quirk. Now before starting, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. It's opening his eyes that hurts the most. The pain is almost as much as the throbbing of his skull, and he groans as he does so. He aches to just roll over, to fall unconscious on whatever hard, cold floor this is and deal with all of this later, but for some reason, that really doesn't feel like an option. So he tries to sit up, body tense from cold, and eventually, but not painlessly, succeeds. His clothes feel sticky and cling to him, but not just like mud and rain. So Izuku tries to rack his aching brain for any information, any memory of what the hell is going on. He'd been at home for the weekend, and that morning on Monday he'd just finished helping Mom clean out the attic of his old stuff, and he'd taken a break to go for a walk around the neighborhood. That's when he'd heard the sirens. Out of curiosity he turned on the old, dinky little radio he'd found in one of the boxes Mom was going to throw away. Long ago he'd used it to tune into police frequencies and track hero fights. He remembered his breath hitching when he'd tuned into the right station. He remembered hearing the address of his old junior high. A kid with a dangerous quirk had held up the place. He'd gone to help, rushing past police lines, barely giving them enough time to see the flash of his provisional license before he was sprinting into the battleground of his old school. And then, Izuku's fist tightened. He couldn't remember anything else. He shakes his head. A voice that sounds suspiciously like Aizawa-sensei forcing its way to the front of his mind. The here and now is most important, get to safety, save people, then go on and fret about everything else. He nods at that. Steadying his breathing, commandeering his shaking limbs into function. There's gravel that sticks to his palms and legs as he shifts. There's rubble of larger stones and broken glass. There's blood on him. It clots and sticks to his cut-up shirt. With wet and mud-soaked hands, he instinctively lifts to clasp at his still pounding head, but all he finds is burning pain as his hand lands right on a large gash. Why is there? Oh! He blinks into his incredibly dim surroundings, doing his best to keep his breathing steady. Keeping his eyes open hurts like hell, and it feels pretty useless without light, so he closes them again and slowly begins to try standing. Something moves in the dark. His ears perk up at the sound, and his breathing hitches. But he's not alone. Hello? A tiny, feminine voice whispers in the dark. It's mixed with a wet cough that sounds horribly painful. Something in his heart tugs him toward her, shuffling at first, then tensing. Just in case, the smell of blood grows several-fold as he moves closer, and his stomach drops. Her silhouette is nothing more than a lump on the floor, but even with such limited sight, he knows she's not doing good. Small green flashes twirl around his legs as he moves even closer, red sneakers stepping into a sticky puddle of blood. The contrasting warmth of his gifted quirk sends sparks of adrenaline through him. The unintended light from his quirk is enough to see her better, just for a second. A bloody body in the darkness. Her abdomen impaled by a large piece of rebar. Oh God, Izuku whispers, kneeling to her side. His stomach in his throat. She seems to try and speak, but whatever she wanted to say catches in her throat as her entire body shakes with the force of her cough. Hey, he whispers, gently, kneeling at her side. I'm a hero, he says, because what else do you say? I'll help you out of this, okay? I just need you to, he swears mentally. He needs to stop her bleeding, but removing the rebar is too dangerous right now. He tugs off his shirt and presses it to the wound. He knows it won't be enough. She's crying, he can feel it in the tremor of her tiny, shaking body. So he wipes away her tears with a blood-stained hand, the other still gently pressing his ruined shirt to the wound. It'll be all right, he assures with an uneven breath. Just breathe. Breathe for me, can you do that? She barely choked out a shake of her head. Her hand reaches out to him, gently placing itself against the hand cradling her cheek. Her hand is so cold, so very cold and thin, and he cradles it the same way one may hold shards of a broken teacup. Precious and sharp, but hopefully, reparable. But the way she smiled, the way her cheek crinkled beneath his palm betrayed that thought, betrayed the idea that she'd live through this. Thank you, she whispered, her voice hoarse and thick. He has no idea why she's thanking him, no clue how he got here. But the blood, hot and sticky, pooling around her, mixing with the blood stains from his own wounds, it mixes with his teardrops as they flood down his cheeks. Why are you, no? He whispered, sharply. Panic spiraling in his mind. This girl, younger than him, is just, she's. No, he says forcefully, why you'll be okay, you dash. Her hand squeezed his, the motion so very small and weak. Stay with me? She whispered. Hot tears bubbled over his vision, anger tightening within his heart at whoever would cause this to happen. At whatever in life that would allow this innocent girl to. I'm so cold, she whispers. His brain nearly shut down. This girl is going to die. The thought hits him like a physical blow. Worse actually, because he can't retaliate, he can't dodge. You'll be okay. He swears, with strength that isn't his, that can't be his. He's still crying, he always is, but there's a part of him that surges with something stronger. Suddenly he can see. The world is more in focus than it was before, and it feels. There's other people here, he can't see them or hear them, but he knows they're there. Wise people, strong ones too. Heroes? It feels like the sports festival, seeing the spirits of the past holders, breaking out from Shinsu's mental hold, only this time. He's looking down over the scene, at his own body, which glows with an almost purple hum around his left arm. The girl, who seems suddenly so much smaller, so much more fragile than she already was. There's a need within him, to protect, to help her. And then there's a tugging from his fingertips. Light at first but then, like vines crawling out from his heart, sprouting from his soul and tugging out through his veins, black whips curl out from his hands, and it feels just like one for all, like power, but this feels elastic too, and he can feel it. He can feel as the black, delicate tendrils wrap around her wound, around the rebar, and hold it. Stable. He stands, and she lifts up with him, the tendrils extending with his left arm, which wraps underneath her, but barely has to touch her. The tendrils, holding her so gently, cradle her and her wounds, allowing him to walk towards a wall. There's a breeze from one of the small cracks, a sliver of light into the world. Like the subtle crack of an oncoming thunderstorm, his other arm fills with the burn of one for all. A steady green crackle that grows from his core and down his right arm. 20, then 30% spiraling down in galactic slashes across his arm and shoulder, humming through him. Instinct kicks into overdrive, and Izuku slams that fist into a wall and prays it's not load-bearing. The entire wall crashes down, crumbling under minimal power. But the sound is so loud, and he can hear the girl cry out weakly in shock, but he's holding her now, his warm arms hold her so steady. The last rays of twilight sunlight break through with the crumble of rock, a cloud of dust kicked up, sirens are still out there, and the narrow room of the now decimate room is caught in the rain. Blood is everywhere, the girl is in his arms, the tendrils still hold the rebar in place, but they've otherwise retreated from, wherever they came from. Izuku can't be sure. All he is sure about is that everyone seems to be staring at him. He moves toward the ambulances, parked thankfully close. Police rush toward him, shouting different things, but they all thankfully identify him as a good guy, even though he's coated in blood. Siren lights continue to shine all too brightly, even among the overcast rain and lowering sun. Hero Deku. One yells quickly. He's shocked enough that they know his name that he looks toward them. The rain falls around them, it's cold. Hey, are you alright? The man asks, was there anyone else in the building? Did you find Dash? She needs treatment, his voice insists, calm and strong and, strangely reminiscent of All Might. Oh of course, the policeman says, but Dash, just behind him a young doctor pushes though. She looks bad Dash, the doctor takes her pulse, and Izuku holds the weakened girl as tightly as he can without hurting her. She's nearing hypothermia, her blood loss Dash, his brain tunes it out, the world buzzing with sensation, the flashing lights glint across cameras, reporters. Oh god, Aizawa-sensei was going to kill him. The rebar is still inside Dash, Izuku explains succinctly. I'm holding it in place. Okay, set her down, here, the doctor says quickly, moving him toward the gurney that has been parked at his side. Gently, he sets her down. That's it, the doctor says. Two other paramedics are already at her side, putting pressure on the wound and holding the rebar in place. The black tendrils retreat, and no one really sees them except him. Her body is so cold. After Izuku had gotten a prompt earful from several detectives, at least two doctors, one of which had been nice enough to give him a change of clothes, some navy blue, soft sweats, and now someone from UA was coming to get him and bring him back to campus. He hoped it was All Might so he could ask what the hell happened to him in there. He also hoped it was All Might because any other option would be 10 times worse. Izuku was, however, learning rather quickly that the most taxing part of being a hero in training was not the pain, broken bones or blood, it was the bureaucracy. Izuku liked to think he wasn't an angry person. But if he had to sign one more form, or say one more statement on what happened, or what he could remember of it at least, he was gonna. Hello there problem child, Aizawa's voice rang out through the small interrogation room they'd set him up in. Instantly he was sitting up straighter, something not that great to do with the slash wound across his back, or the concussion he'd been diagnosed with. Hey sensei, Izuku said sheepishly, not at all meeting his teacher's eyes. Aizawa was in his regular hero uniform, his shoes squeaking on the white floor. Was it still raining outside? Tell me, Aizawa-sensei said with a low groan, rubbing at his eyes. Why, when something happens, is it always you? He asked. There was a tiredness to his voice that told Izuku that his teacher had definitely been dealing with a similar amount of paperwork. I'm sorry, sensei, Izuku said meekly. The chair creaked as he moved to stand, but Aizawa-sensei motioned for him to stay seated. There was the unmistakable feeling that Aizawa-sensei wanted to say something more, but then Detective Tsukachi walked in, and everything was quiet. Izuku took a deep breath of the stale air. It smelled like detergent and dry paper. The door opened, and in came Detective Tsukachi, his trench coat sweeping in with his quick strides. Mr. Eraserhead, the detective spoke, moving in and towards his teacher, the door shutting firmly behind them. You're free to take him back to campus, but he needs to be kept under medical observation, Detective Tsukachi said, flipping through a sizable clipboard of papers. And he will definitely be doing counseling until he regains all of his memory. His memory? Aizawa said, peeking his eyebrow. Izuku slowly began to slouch, sinking in on himself. Tsukachi looked up at his teacher. He hasn't told you? Due to all the paperwork and reporters outside, Aizawa said with a level amount of bitterness, I've been here for approximately a minute and a half, so, no. He hasn't. Then Aizawa turned toward Izuku, eyes sharp like a weapon. But for some reason, he softened. Aizawa huffed and rolled his eyes. You'll tell me what happened in the car. It was a statement, not a question. The car? Izuku parroted dumbly. Yes, Aizawa said, quick and easy, we're getting you back to campus. Tsukachi looked at him, then at Aizawa. I'm sure that you know that anything he says to the press will dash. Yes. Aizawa said, his expression solid. But my priority is to get him back to his school, safely. Tsukachi took a moment. He is still a kid, Aizawa said, the words low enough that Izuku wasn't 100% sure he was supposed to have heard them. Tsukachi breathed a sigh, then nodded. He flipped through his for a moment papers, before handing Aizawa one that had been folded rather haphazardly. Thank you, detective, Aizawa said solidly. He reached out a hand and formally shook hands with Tsukachi. Izuku nodded along. Even though he wasn't 100% sure what was even really going on. Aizawa waved for Izuku to follow as Tsukachi held his lanyard to the scanner, and the door clicked and unlocked. Come on, kid, Aizawa said, pushing open the heavy door. Izuku shuffled up from his seat, bowing to Tsukachi quickly. Thank you, Detective Tsukachi, Izuku said quietly. Detective Tsukachi let out a dreary sigh, then nodded. Just doing my job. He smiled, then paused. Tell the big man, hi, for me though, he said. Of course, Izuku nodded, and then Izuku was out the door, shuffling quick but quiet to match Aizawa-sensei's long strides. His red sneakers still slightly damp squeaking across the tile. Izuku followed behind his teacher through another few sterile-looking hallways, and to a large set of doors with 2 guards at each side. Kid, you haven't dealt with paparazzi before, have you? It wasn't really a question, but something about it lay a weight onto Izuku's chest. Aizawa handed up the folded-up piece of paper to one of the guards. No, sensei, Izuku said honestly, picking at a loose thread in the cuff of his navy blue sweatshirt. Aizawa-sensei just rubbed a tired hand down his face. Just, don't say anything. And stick close. The guard, who almost seemed surprised at whatever was written inside the paper, before hastily opening the door for them, out into the thick and misty night's air, and right into a rather large crowd that seemed to be being barely held back by a few policemen. Noise assaulted his senses, the loud click and flash of cameras, the yells of what he had to assume were reporters. Questions, his mind registered. Questions and people yelling his hero name? Hero Deku. Do you have any statements on what happened this morning? One woman yelled, shoving a microphone in his face. Izuku said tensely, feeling like a deer in the headlights of a 10,000-ton train. Hero Deku. Over here. Another loud man yelled, how did you manage to get so many children to safety in such little time? What dash? Hero Deku. Another yelled. Some people are calling you the new All Might. How do you feel about that? And dash. There wasn't much time to think even about the garage of questions, as Aizawa-sensei quickly pressed himself tightly in front of him. The 2 guards from the doors came to shield his back, surrounding him in a rather awkward human shield that shuffled forward. We will not be answering questions at this time, Aizawa bellowed loudly and forcibly into the crowd. At which they all seemed to ignore flashing pictures nonetheless, though Izuku had to be thankful that his teacher's tall dark body shielded him from the worst of it now, his fingers gripping the back of Aizawa-sensei's shirt in his panic. Hero Deku. Hero Deku. The crowd continued to slam him with questions. About his quirk, about his heroic journey, about DMN near anything and everything. Deku. What about the kids you saved? Another yelled. Do you have any statements for them or their families? Dash. Deku, is it true that your quirk bloomed only months before the UA entrance exam? What was your training regimen to be able to come into it so quickly? Deku, what is your connection to All Might? Some say dash. Deku, what was your involvement in the dash? Then suddenly Aizawa was pushing him in front of him, in through the door of a sleek black car. He scotched into the far side, Aizawa entering the car behind them. The crowd grew muffled as the door slammed shut behind them. Reporters trying and failing to still be heard, trying desperately for one last picture. Fing vultures, Aizawa swore to himself. Izuku just sat quietly, doing his best to relax into the relative quiet as he buckled up and the car smoothly began to pull away. Too many thoughts were shooting through his brain, too much was going on. So he closed his eyes, and breathed. Spill kid, the drive isn't that long. Aizawa's voice seemed to finally knock Midoriya out of his stupor, of watching the blur of roads and buildings slowly shift into trees. Sorry sir, Midoriya clutched his hands together, fiddling with the sleeves of his navy blue sweatshirt, something that had been given to him by one of the doctors, Aizawa assumed, given his real shirt had been destroyed thoroughly enough that it was confiscated as evidence. Aizawa rolled his eyes. This kid, he swore. Don't worry, you're not going to be punished, he said. That's not really it, Midoriya said, wringing his hands together like old rags. Are the kids okay? Aizawa hummed. From what I've heard, the very last girl you saved was the worst injured, he said. Of the ones who survived, his mind chimed. But he shook that thought away, this kid didn't need to think about that now. Chisai Sabeba, 13 years old, Aizawa said solidly. The girl with the rebar in her stomach, Midoriya completed, nodding slightly, his expression mournful. How's she doing? Is she? He swallowed, seeming unable to speak the words. She's alive, Aizawa said. Midoriya didn't look up at that, but he did nod. Currently Sabeba-san is in the hospital, coming down from critical condition. Some pieces of the rebar hit her spine. From what I heard she'll likely be paralyzed from the waist down. He paused, voice softening. But she's alive. Midoriya swallowed, and nodded. Aizawa could tell the kid was beating himself up about it. She didn't die, that was good. But, kid, don't dwell on it, Aizawa said solidly. Reaching over to place a hand on the boy's shoulder, to provide him with something to ground him in reality. Midoriya looked up, and goddamn it, his eyes looked so aged. And yet he still looked so small. He really was just a kid. Why don't you tell me what happened? Aizawa asked, patting Midoriya's shoulder once. All right, Midoriya said, taking a deep breath, running a hand up and into his hair, wincing slightly as the unconscious motion jostled his wound. I was at home, helping Mom pack up some of my old stuff over the weekend. And since it's Monday, and most of it was done. I went on a walk to get some air, you know? And I heard sirens. So you just heard sirens and followed them? Aizawa said, feeling slightly unimpressed. No. Air? Well, when I was a kid I used to, I liked seeing heroes. Midoriya said, seeming rather self-conscious, and I had a little radio that I'd tune into so I could, find dash. Aizawa held up his hand, and Midoriya paused. You were one of those hero fight tracking kids, weren't you? Aizawa asked. It really wasn't a question. He really should have expected this kind of reckless behavior from the problem child. Yeah. Many heroes hated when kids, or even adults, did that. Because it put them in harm's way, especially if things got out of hand. Aizawa was unabashedly one of them. You know how dangerous that is, right? Aizawa said. He'd been aware as almost everyone in UA was at this point of how much of a fanboy Midoriya could be. His room was basically an all-might shrine at this point, so he really should have expected this. Midoriya just looked down, seeming to grow guiltier with the second. Aizawa sighed. Anyway, he gestured for Izuku to continue. You tuned into the frequency for the police radio? Yeah. I tuned in and, he paused a moment. It was my old junior high. A kid had been bullied there for having a villainous quirk, something about having explosive blood I think. So the kid was destroying the school, just room by room. Everyone still hiding inside. He curled in tighter on himself. Teachers, kids, and nobody wanted to leave the building because that'd make them an even easier target. Oh, out in the open like that, and I heard that. And, well, that there were no heroes in the area. So I thought you thought you'd just be fishing people out of rubble. Yeah. I thought I could help, but when I got there something had happened to the kid. It wasn't a vengeance thing anymore, it was. What was it? The kid, they had this look in their eyes, like they had nothing to go back to. And you rushed in? Yeah, Izuku said, rubbing at his neck. At least that's what they tell me. You don't remember? I remember rushing in, sort of at least, but the kid wasn't alone. There were several of them. And one of them had a strength quirk because he hit me, Izuku said, his hand lifting to tap at the bandages across his head. Everything after that is kind of a blur. Aizawa leaned slightly forward. More than just one kid, huh? A whole team of kids? That's a lot of coordination for kids, but not impossible. Especially when pushed to such an extreme. What of it do you remember? I remember getting past those kids. I think tying them up somewhere. Midoriya paused. I remember getting into different rooms and just grabbing people and picking them up. Midoriya swallowed tightly, curling in toward himself. There were so many people. I was just piling them up and taking them outside, and God, it was so hard to tell who was even alive. Midoriya choked. Aizawa wanted to tell him to stop, to remember to breathe, but he was rambling now. And there, Midoriya swallowed, there were so many kids were just covered in blood or smearing themselves in other kids' blood so they could play dead better. And I just remember hauling out bodies, going deeper into the school. Then the kids who caused it got free. I think I was in one of the very back rooms at the time, but all I can really recall is waking up and finding that girl, Sabeba-san? And then Izuku motioned, throwing a punch, presumably at the wall. He paused to look at the window, the school coming up quickly in the distance. A small crowd seemed to have gathered out front, probably Class 1A. Even though Aizawa had specifically told them to give Midoriya space upon his return. He really needed to stop presuming his kids would listen to him. Aizawa turned to look back at Midoriya, to see the boy curled up in his seat, knees to his chest, tightly pressed against the wall. I am sorry, sensei, Izuku muttered. No, it's okay, kid, Aizawa assured gently. You did well. He sighed to himself. You shouldn't had to do that alone. But don't heroes have to do that alone all the time? Midoriya asked softly, looking at him with those wide green eyes of his. You're not a hero yet, kiddo, Aizawa said, ignoring the strange urge to ruffle the kid's hair. They pulled up to the building, a small crowd of, as he'd predicted, 1A students parked out front. And, a word of advice? Aizawa offered, unbuckling himself, giving Midoriya time to do the same. Don't rush it. It's not as glamorous as it seems. I think I know, Izuku muttered. And Aizawa had to say he didn't doubt it. Ochako Uraraka liked to think she didn't worry overly much. She was usually pretty good under pressure. Sure, there were moments where she lost it, where she freaked out, but all in all, Ochako liked to think that she could be as calm and relaxed as the next budding heroine. But then Deku had to go out and be, well, Deku. And she had to wake up from her mid-noon nap to Ida pounding on her door, yelling that Deku was on TV. And to some other people that might be fun and exciting, but with them? Well, let's just say she didn't even change, sprinting then sliding down the railing and into the common room, still in her plaid pink pajamas. Her heart in her throat as she realized she wasn't the only one terrified out of their minds. All eyes had been glued to the screen. A student from UA High, Hero Deku, has been captured under the rubble, the newscaster repeated. His state is still unknown. Wait. I'm getting something in now. Suddenly, everyone was even more on the edge of their seats. Hero Deku is, oh my, see cut to the live cameras. The newscaster seems genuinely startled, the act so sharp and cut with nostalgia, she couldn't hide it. This is breaking news, folks, she says as a shaky camera zooms in on a figure, emerging from the rubble. Hero Deku, a provisional licensed student from UA dove in to help evacuate civilian students from a decimated Aldera Junior High, is now pulling bodies from the rubble. Oh my god, he's dash. Audio cut in from the on-site cameras, people screaming in the background, dust and smoke rising as, from the rubble, Deku emerged. He wasn't even in his hero costume, just a regular shirt and jeans. Torn up and bloodied, and yet, there was something impossible about him. Green lightning strkng around his arms and legs, hair brushed back by how fast he surely must have been moving. He was wounded and he carried bodies, children mostly, slung over his shoulders, and in his arms seemed to be a teacher. The civilians seemed wounded too, cut up and bruised and burnt, but they were alive. Ochako gripped the edge of her seat. Watching her friend, her fellow student, quickly deliver people to ambulances before, without a thought to himself, rushing back into the fray. There was still screaming, but from the crowd there were cheers. People screaming Deku's name. Cheering him onward. And Deku, he was mostly unharmed. He was keeping calm, helping people to safety and a second live camera cut in, this one closer to the action. Only slightly obscured by the drizzling rain. The microphone just barely picked up Midoriya, who seemed to be talking to one of the wounded kids, who climbed up onto his shoulders, the little girl clutching her bleeding shoulder. It's okay, Deku assured, his voice crackling low and smooth. You're going to be okay, he smiled at the little girl, helping her up onto his back. I'm here. The image blurred with tears as Ochako rubbed at her eyes. Thanking any higher power there might be that he was still alive. That he was okay because... Oh my god, she gasped, just doing her best to keep from leaping up and finding the fastest way to him. He's just like All Might, Todoroki evaluated softly, the words so soft, so gentle, they didn't even sound like they came from him. Bokugo said nothing. Seconds later, Aizawa-sensei entered the room, his shoulders squared and expression pissed off. Ochako took note that he was on the phone. What do you mean there's no one you can spare? He's alone in there. Aizawa yelled into the speaker of his phone. The class turned toward him, ready and on edge. The person on the other end of the line must have said something particularly idiotic, based off of Aizawa-sensei's loud, furious words just moments later. No, no way. I'm going over there. And, all due respect? Right off. That is a child in there, and he does not get to be your little tin soldier before he even graduates. The person on the other end seemed to be trying to argue, but it seemed to be a losing battle, at least against Aizawa-sensei's righteous fury. Moreover, Aizawa continued furiously, his hair and capture scarf lifting from his shoulders. That's my student in there. And either I'm going in after him, or you're getting an actual hero on the scene instead of leaving this sheet to a goddamn teenager. Aizawa screamed. He slammed his phone down, hanging up and shoving it deep into his pockets. Sensei, Ida said, already standing and solid. Ready to suit up in an instant, ready to jump in there like a trained Black Ops squad. Are we dash? You all are staying here, Aizawa said, to the great displeasure of every student in there. I am going to go help your classmate who dash. That was when it all got worse. Deku had just re-entered the building, and only seconds later, another explosion careened from inside the building. The news camera shook with the force of it, the force of the collapsing building blasting through the speakers and bringing all of their attention back to the screen. Screams came from all around, through the screen and from her classmates, and Ochako didn't even realize one had come from her until she felt a cool hand gripping her shoulder. Azui pulled her close, trembling slightly, and Ochako clung right back to her. Several people swore in a row, most notable of which being Aizawa and Bokugo. That was when everything on the scene got quiet. I'm going, Aizawa-sensei said. Now. Don't do anything stupid while I'm gone. Aizawa exclaimed, already sprinting out towards the door. Ochako wanted to yell back that they couldn't make promises like that, but she couldn't. Not in the silence. Not as they waited for any sign that Deku was. Ochako couldn't tell how long it was that they just sat there, breath tight in their chests. Police and firefighters and rescue teams had taken to the rubble. The newscaster rambling on about specific departments that had been called, but all eyes were transfixed on the broken walls of the school. Firefighters and policemen taking their time to not disrupt the fragile structure of the rubble. It was slow progress, but they were doing at least something. Meanwhile, all onlookers, civilian and otherwise, were forced to watch with bated breath as the silence just drew out. Longer and thicker, deeper, like drowning. The rain still poured down on the scene. And it was then that Ochako noticed it. There was movement from within the walls. Did you see that? Ochako said quietly, the words more of a gasp of breath than anything else. Several of her classmates turned to her. There. She said, stronger, pointing to the bottom left of the screen. It was barely able to be seen if not for the sharp green and, kind of purple, glow that was slowly growing from the small cracks in the half-crumpled wall. It's glowing! Ashido exclaimed sharply. The class once again perching tightly on their seats to get a better light, praying the cameraman would notice and pan over. And he did. The camera zoomed in on the wall, on the pulsing light that didn't seem to dim even once. Then the wall just exploded. At first, through the loud crash of falling rubble, like the crack of an oncoming thunderstorm, the screams of onlookers, they fear it's the attacker again. But as the smoke clears, they see green. They see Izuku. And everyone lets out a loud whoop in relief, cheering loudly and riotously because he's alive and he did it and he's okay. But there was someone in his arms. A civilian, seeming in very poor condition. The rain seemed to lighten a bit as the last rays of twilight sunshine broke through the dust cloud that surrounded Deku. Even as he moved forward, sirens still shrieked in the background, and the narrow room Deku was trapped in is wide open. Blood was everywhere, slowly being washed off by rain droplets, but the girl is in his arms seems pale, but somehow conscious. She's been impaled on a piece of rebar, something, it's hard to see what, perhaps black bandages of some kind hold the rebar in place, keeping it from damaging her further. Deku moves toward the ambulance, silent among the crowds and chaos and cheers in his name. He doesn't even seem to be touching the ground really, he's moving, walking, but something about it just seems off. Siren lights continue to shine all too brightly, even among the overcast rain and lowering sun. Hero Deku! Someone yells quickly. He turns, eyes locking before his head swivels toward the person. The rain falls around them, but it doesn't even seem to affect Deku. Barely even touching him. It's hard to tell what else is being spoken as the newscaster cuts in, as the class whoops and hollers and cheers that Deku is actually okay. He made it. A police officer comes up to meet Deku halfway as he barks questions at an entirely too calm Deku. But even they don't really seem to mind. A doctor and 2 paramedics come up and help to guide the girl, still in Deku's arms, onto a gurney parked at his side. They put pressure on the wound and quickly begin to cart her towards an ambulance. Deku just looks hollow. He shakes the hand of a police officer, and a fireman, and a woman who looks to be a mother of one of the kids he saved. He waves at the crowd, and smiles, but he's soon pulled off and away by police officers to give a statement. The newscaster cuts to something more about the damage, about the kid who caused it all. Apparently it had been several kids, but the ringleader had been some kid with an explosive blood quirk. The kid had been bullied so heavily, he decided to destroy the school. Everyone's still inside. It's a somber topic, but no one is really paying attention to it. Kirishima is rambling about how awesome and manly Deku looked carrying people from the rubble, while Bokugu denies it being that cool. Mina is excitedly getting Hagakure to help her make a card for when Deku gets back. So, really, no one's listening to the broadcast. An open window invites a draft, which courses through the room. A cold ruffle following the scent of an oncoming storm. And outside, the rain only pours. Izuku felt like he'd had just enough of crowds, thank you very much. What with the police at the actual site, and the reporters at the police station, he was really over it already. So when the sleek car rolled smoothly to a stop right in front of another thankfully smaller crowd, Izuku had to bite back the extremely tired sigh that tried to crawl its way out from his throat, but manifested as nothing more than a slight cough. Aizawa-sensei, however, did let out a sigh of his own, which Izuku looked up towards, still leaning, curled up and leaning against the cool weight of the door. I thought I told them when I called, not to crowd, Aizawa muttered, seemingly to himself, but the man had obviously meant for him to hear. He didn't have a muttering problem like Izuku did. It's fine, Izuku said gently, the words heavy on his chest. He stared out the tinted window, where rain droplets still clung, but no new ones fell. They're just worried, he said. Aizawa looked towards him, seeming to want to say something, then pausing. He took a breath. Let's just go, the sooner you rest the sooner you'll heal, Aizawa said, offering nothing more as Izuku popped open the handle on his side of the car, and slowly, with his aching body, chimed out. Quickly, the entire crowd began to speak as soon as he exited the car, squinting into the odd lighting coming from the dorms, coming to stand at the front of the doors. Midoriya. Oh my god someone exclaimed, it was hard to tell who as his entire class swarmed him. Oh gosh, are you alright Mamami? Aoyama exclaimed. We made you a card. He was pretty sure that was Ashido, as her pink hand suddenly shoved a homemade card, covered in glitter and signatures that all wished him different congratulations, toward him. We saw you on TV. Kirishima exclaimed exuberantly. Dude, you look like All Might. It was hella manly. Yeah. You saved like 100 people. Kaminari chimed, it was so Deku. Uraraka yelled, pushing and shoving her way to the front to immediately wrap him in a hug. The gesture was welcome. The pain that flared through his wounds at the tightness of it, was less so. Still, it was nice. Even among the chatter, the fresh, rain-soaked air flowed into his senses, the chirp of crickets, the familiarity of being on school grounds. I thought I told all of you, Aizawa spoke up, his low drone instantly quieting the questioning, which Izuku's headache was ever so grateful for. Not to make a scene. He stood with his arms crossed. The small crowd meekly shied in on themselves. Yes, Aizawa-sensei is correct. Ida's familiar voice cut through the lower din, let us please give Midoriya some space. I am sure he has been through quite the ordeal. Ida's hand motioned in chopping motions to the crowd, which did reluctantly retreat. How are you doing? Uraraka asked, pulling out from her hug, her hands still resting on his shoulders. There was a warmth to her touch, even through the fleece of his navy sweats, but his head still pounded gently in his skull, and his body and wounds ached with lethargy. I'm fine, Izuku said, mostly on instinct. A bit dinged up, but fine. He smiled, it didn't meet his eyes. Uraraka frowned at the bags under those eyes, usually so bright and energetic, now just watching. They say the eyes are the window to the soul, but Midoriya had locked the latches, drawn the curtains, and turned out the lights, giving no sign as to what was really going on within. Ah, Midoriya Shonen, came a small, but no less powerful voice from beside them. How are you faring? I heard you got into quite the scuffle, Principal Nezu asked, his smile never once falling. I'm fine, sir, Midoriya said, standing a little straighter, an act that made his muscles ache with the effort. Principal Nezu had always kind of unnerved him. And it wasn't that he wasn't human, that Izuku had no qualms about. But there had always been something about the mouse-bear creature's raw intellect, the way he didn't really look at you as much as look through you. Then do you mind coming with me for a moment? Nezu said. It wasn't actually a question. Nezu was the principal, Izuku was the student. If there was a choice, it wasn't on Izuku's end. Sure. Izuku looked toward Aizawa, who seemed to be in a one-man staring contest with the principal, who didn't even really seem to be paying attention to the teacher. Only smiling patiently at Izuku. His stare felt kind of like playing with the pin on a grenade, only worse. All due respect, Aizawa's voice broke through his thoughts, the words a low rumble in his chest, but don't you think Midoriya needs his rest? The words barely betrayed any emotion at all, but his posture taking a slow step forward, placing himself ever so slightly between his student and Nezu. Of course. Young humans do need their rest, Nezu said with a smile, bouncing on the ball of his feet. Pause. That is why we will be brief. And don't worry, we will be stopping by Recovery Girls so she can get a good look at him. Aizawa didn't look happy, but he didn't do anything else to pull Izuku back. So, Izuku left, following closely behind his principal. Don't fret, I will return him as soon as I am done, Principal Nezu called over his shoulder, still smiling. Yes, sir, Aizawa droned lowly, with some amount of bitterness. Izuku couldn't catch whatever else Aizawa-sensei said, but he did see his classmates and their pensive, then disappointed expressions, as Aizawa turned them back towards the dorms. Izuku felt their eyes lingering on him. And if Nezu did too, he didn't say anything about it. Evil is a weed. It grows in cracked roads and crumbling houses and forgotten corners, rooted in indifference and watered by suffering. Evil is a weed, and weeds pop up everywhere. You may pass them daily even, and you may not even notice them until it's too late, until the sidewalk is crumbling and the structure of it has been broken. Evil is a weed, and weeds are only a testament to how little people really care. This was a concept that Nezu had become well acquainted with in his lifetime. It was one of the reasons he had wanted to be a teacher. He knew that the only way to assure a strong hero base in society was to put himself on the front lines of it. Perhaps that's why this particular report had caught his attention. Sir? Midoriya spoke up, his voice shaking and shoulders hunched. Nezu had not really noticed, nor minded, the silence, but Nezu liked to think he had become moderately well acquainted with human body language over the years, and he could tell that Midoriya was becoming increasingly anxious by it. You're not in any trouble, don't worry, Nezu said, allowing a small amount of amusement to seep into his voice. Young humans always had been so worried when called to go with him somewhere, not that it was shocking, per se. He'd been told that he carried a rather intimidating aura. Sorry, but, Midoriya said, finally looking to meet his eye, their pace slowing a fraction as he did so. If I'm not being punished, then why am I here? Straight to the point. Nezu enjoyed that about Midoriya. He wasn't one to try mental games or as laughable as the effort was at times to try to outsmart his principal. Not that teenagers were usually very good at that, even when they tried. There have been a few breakthroughs in the case. Several of the police wanted to get your input as soon as possible. Breakthroughs? Midoriya said, blinking slightly. Case? Yes, Nezu said with a nod, turning the corner to continue down the hall. It appears as though there has been more to this than meets the eye, Nezu says, and smiles. Oh, does he love a good mystery. Now, tell me, was there anything about your confrontation that seemed especially strange? Midoriya thought for a moment, his unbandaged hand lifted to tap at his chin. Not blurting out the first thing that came to mind, instead taking his time, letting the question sit for a moment before answering. That was good. Their quirks did seem rather strong for junior high students, Midoriya recalled thoughtfully. Did they get training? But, why train for a suicide attempt? Nezu nodded. Though he did enjoy watching his students think, exercising the valuable muscle that was the mind, he knew that the boy would need to know this, sooner rather than later. The official statement and what they can find from the perpetrators' bodies shows that they had been being hopped up on a low-dosage trigger beforehand. Nezu moved toward the set of stairs, Midoriya following quickly behind. It's assumed that, originally, the teens had only made this plan in hypotheticals, Nezu explained. A way to decompress from the stress of their bullying, a form of catharsis if you will, Nezu said, waiting for his student to make some sort of aghast motion. To exclaim or gasp in some way. Instead, Midoriya looked thoughtful for a moment, before slowly nodding with the air of someone who understood that thought process. Interesting. Nezu continued after only a beat of silence, never falling off track. But due to the emotional and physical instability that trigger causes, Nezu purposefully let his sentence hang in the air. They ended up really going through with it. Midoriya finished complicity. He crossed his arms, but the motion seemed more like he was hugging himself. A grounding action of some kind. One he continued even as they arrived at the large oak doors to the principal's office. But how? Midoriya swallowed tightly. Nezu had expected this, denial, fear. He couldn't blame young Midoriya for that, for the human idea that, since they had never had something bad happen to them in a certain place, that place was pure and untouchable. It was a foolish ordeal. Murders and drag deals happen everywhere, and to deny that fact was to deny the truth. But it was the human condition to do so, as it appeared. I live in that neighborhood my whole life, Midoriya said gently, and I never dash. You also never actively looked for it, Nezu finished evenly, logically. And, before one for all, trigger would have been rather useless to you. Would it not? I guess, Midoriya muttered, but something about his expression was too thoughtful. It didn't quite match what Nezu had thought the boy's reaction would be to such indisputable logic. Something about this situation seemed to resonate with Midoriya. How puzzling. Nevertheless, Nezu opened the door to his office, with a smile, inviting the boy in. Just in time for a strong gust of wind to hit. Midoriya, my boy! The strong voice of All Might exclaimed as soon as Midoriya entered the room. Nezu almost laughed as Toshinori rushed at Midoriya. He was glad that Toshinori had actually followed his orders to stay in his office. Even with the promise of his successor arriving shortly, there had been no guarantee that, in true All Might fashion, Toshinori wouldn't have just burst through a door or even a wall to get to his successor. Are you alright? How are you feeling? Toshinori cooed, checking over the boy in a fashion not unlike a mother hen. All Might. I'm fine. Midoriya exclaimed, his cheeks flushed with embarrassment over being treated in such a careful yet smothering manner. After a few moments more of Toshinori freaking out over his almost son and Midoriya growing more embarrassed with the second, they did eventually stop their small circus. All Might tugged the boy into a hug, smiling in the most relaxed way Nezu had seen since they'd first heard Midoriya was in danger. I'm glad you're okay, my boy, Toshinori said with a gentle smile. That was when the door crept open, and someone cleared their throat. Midoriya Izuku had always been something of a one-man kamikaze squad. Well, maybe not always. But for long enough that it seemed to be his nature by now. Long enough that Ida Tenya had never really known much different. It was odd. When he'd first met the boy, Tenya had, as many of the competitors in the UA entrance exam, dismissed Midoriya. From the boy's relatively plain appearance to his excitable, distracting mumbling, he just seemed so terribly unfit to even be considered competition, especially for someone going into one of the top hero schools in the country. He was just too nervous, quite literally tripping over his own feet before the starting line. But maybe that was what made Midoriya so dangerous. The fact that, at 1 second, Tenya had been speeding away from the 0-point monstrosity, watching Midoriya frozen in fear. And the next he was watching someone, shoot into the sky. Watching the streak of green shoot at the hulking robot, colliding with it, a crack like thunder splitting through and sending a shockwave through the air, and then watching pieces of shrapnel and metal fall from the sky, watching as, for that moment, that frightened boy turned into something else entirely. There was a dichotomy somewhere within his friend. Between trembling, mumbling teenager everyone knew and something else. Tenya knew it then, somewhere in the recesses of his mind. He knew that Midoriya Izuku was more than he'd seemed. But the human mind will do a lot to stay sane, to keep its worldviews intact. So Tenya didn't think about it beyond that. He assumed that Midoriya somehow knew there was more to the exam instead of that just being the boy's nature, to see someone in need of help and be willing to literally destroy himself from the inside out to help. But just because Tenya had pushed this revelation into his subconscious did not mean it didn't exist, and it didn't mean that would be the last time he'd see that thing. Whatever it was that lived under Midoriya's skin, whatever gave him that utterly impossible amount of drive. Whatever it was that lived in his body, a vessel much too small to contain it properly, so it leaked out through Midoriya's fate-shaking nature and self-sacrifice. Whatever it was that made Midoriya like that. The first time Tenya had seen it up close was during the stain incident. He had been blinded by rage, on a tyrannous rampage for lackluster vengeance, and yet even with his thorough planning, his secret keeping of where he was going and why, Midoriya, who had not even been in Hosu for his internship, but somehow showed up anyway, had figured out his plans. Tenya remembered the exact moment, when he'd finally met Stain. He'd been terrified. hauling pro-hero native out of the line of fire. He'd gotten in only a few good blows before being struck, paralyzed on the cold ground. He'd thought he was going to die there. But then Midoriya, no, Deku, arrived. Looking more feral, protective beast than noble, all-saving warrior. Shooting off the walls of the alley like a sharp bullet ricochet. Fighting Stain, a villain whose mission was to kill them, a real threat to their lives, and matching him mostly punch for punch. Throwing himself into battle with the smooth, practiced revolution of a bullet chambering. And even in Midoriya's headlong rush to protect, he'd even had the good sense to call for backup. To know that he couldn't do this alone. It was a kind of common sense that Tenya himself had realized, was in fact, quite rare. Maybe that's why Tenya hadn't cheered like his classmates had, when Deku pulled himself, and that wounded girl, from the rubble. Because this time, unlike every other time, he had no help. He had no backup. He was alone. And yet that feral piece of him was still laying bare, cameras capturing even the slightly terrifying pieces of his friend that Tenya had before then convinced himself had been mere lighting or imagination, or anything but real. But the way he barely seemed to touch the ground as he walked, as if floating on air, was all too real. The way Deku's plain green eyes shined like poison was no trick. And the way that Deku smiled, as if his head weren't gushing blood, as if the pain that surely had to be racking his body, didn't even affect him. It had been nearly an hour and a half after Midoriya had gotten back to campus, only to subsequently be pulled away by none other than the school's principal. The euphoria that Midoriya had gotten out of the fight without any broken bones or long-standing wounds that they knew of, at least had long since faded, and was left with a buzz of anxiety that flittered through the common room. Anxiety that flitted with thoughts of, what if we missed something, what if something else went wrong, what if he had to be carted off to the hospital after all? What if? Tenya knew dwelling on things one cannot change wasn't healthy, but he wasn't about to try and cart people off to bed when they were probably just going to stay up anyway, waiting for Midoriya to return, as proven by even their usual early sleepers, such as Tokoyami, Bokugo, and himself, staying up in the common room. He wasn't about to strip everyone of their chopping mechanisms when he himself was not doing any better. So here they were. Seated near silently, the TV dully playing reruns of the news feeds, of the few commentaries that had been made by newscasts before flitting off to some other story of the day. A window had been left open, giving the faint scent of fresh pine from the woods around the school, and the chirp of crickets in the cool night. They had been shepherded inside by Aizawa-sensei over an hour and a half ago, and from then the restless energy had only grown. And Tenya knew, probably better than anyone else, that restlessness in Class 1A never really ended well. Any word? Kaminari asked for what had to be the 30th time. Still fiddling with Ojiro's tail as it swished back and forth. Nothing, Uraraka said with a long-standing sigh, shooting off another text before setting her phone down on the few inches of space between her and Ida, leaning slightly against Azui. Maybe they confiscated his phone? Or it got broken during the fight. Jairu said, twirling her earphone jacks around her finger in a quick and nervous motion. That would explain why my texts are just being put on delivered. Uraraka sighed, leaning further against Azui, who wrapped her arm around her friend, a simple symbol of shared comfort. Ida swallowed tightly, still sitting rigidly straight in his own seat. Kirishima said, from where he had draped himself over a surprisingly complacent Bokuga's lap, who seemed to be using it as an excuse as to why he hadn't gone to bed. Because he wouldn't be waiting for stupid Deku to get back? Of course not. I wish, Kirishima said, hesitating only slightly, I wish we knew anything at all. We don't even know why Principal Nedzu wanted to talk to him. Or why they're taking so long, Todoroki said, leaning back against Uraraka's calves, a part of the large group who had decided on sitting on the floor and working on their homework, which really just meant having their homework in front of them as they fiddled with their pencils and phones. Aoyama's glitter pens also being scattered amongst the mess. Tenya watched his classmates peter onto smaller conversations, Kaminari showing Jairu a meme, Yayorozu and Ishido working on some sort of care package just in case Midoriya did end up in the hospital, somehow. It came so easily to them. Being social, sharing, talking, leaning against each other. Ida-kun, Karo, Azui said gently, are you okay? The words came so easy to her, the gentle tilt to her head, her wide eyes. They were all gentle and concerned, mirrored by Uraraka. And no. I'm perfectly fine, thank you, he said with a sharp motion. Instantly regretting the distanced words as soon as they came out. He sighed. I supposed I am somewhat worried, he admitted a moment later. Midoriya-kun has never been very good at taking care of himself, but running into a school in the middle of it being quite literally decimated? Without any backup? Tenya had never been a fan of being at a loss for words, but that didn't change the fact that he was. Yeah, I get that. Kirishima said, rubbing his hands at his tired eyes. Midoriya always has such a strong sense of justice, and don't get me wrong, it's hella manly. Kirishima said, flexing his bicep and smiling toothily, which was kind of an odd look with him draped across Bokugu's lap. But goddamn, I just wish I knew anything more. Like, Kirishima gestured wildly before letting out a loud groan of frustration. Several others from around the room agreed, as they lifted their drinks, cans of soda and energy drinks clinking chunkily against glasses of water and juice in faux cheers to his poorly worded vexation. The silence that followed gave them pause, as Kirishima seemed to notice Bokugu's fighting just moments before he spoke up. It was mine and Deku's stupid junior high, Bokugu said. Everyone kind of blinked at that. What? Tenya said. He knew that Bokugu and Midoriya had known each other for a while, but does that mean they really grew up together? God, I know you're blind but you fucking deaf too? Bokugu snarled irately. I said that place Deku fucking charged into was Aldera Junior High, he said defensively. Me and Deku's old school. Wait, Kaminari said, sitting up sharply, does that mean you and Midoriya might have had friends in there? Unfucking likely, I was always too good for that place, he said, not exacerbating on Midoriya's side of things. Tenya did tap his chin at that though, thoughtful. That would explain why Midoriya was so good at hauling people from the rubble though, Tenya said, sharing a nod with Uraraka. He knew the layout already. The entire class seemed to kind of nod, soaking in the new information like a dry sponge. A breeze fluttered through the window, the draft leading a cold feeling that fluttered through the papers on the table. It worked as a good excuse for the people in his class to tuck closer to each other. Tenya tried his best to tamp down the feeling inside him. He had been keeping track, and there was a rather surprisingly long list of fields in which he'd realized his skill was woefully lacking, things he had never been taught, or things he'd just never learned through whatever social osmosis by which everyone else seemed to learn. And casual touch definitely made it on that list. Hey Ida-kun, Uraraka said. Yes, Uraraka-san? Tenya said gently. Then she just sort of patted her lap. Tenya blinked, then furrowed his brow. He looked up at her in confusion. Azui looked at Uraraka with an odd fondness to her smile as she patted her lap again. Uraraka sighed, then spoke up. Wanna lay across me and Azui? What? Tenya said, instantly going rigid. Why? Cold puts me in a hibernating state, Karo, Azui said with a blank expression. I'd like to still be awake for when Midoriya-kun gets back. Sure. I would be happy to help out a fellow classmate. He said, smiling completely insecurely. How? Ida whispered, not really wanting to ask, but still wanting to make sure they were comfortable. Here, Azui offered, already moving, me and Achiko can trade places and you can lay across us. Uraraka nodded, shifting her leg slightly to let Todoroki, who had been half leaning against her calf, know that she was moving. Oh okay, Tenya said, his motions tense. After some reshuffling, Todoroki now leaning similarly against the foot of the couch by Azui, Tenya turned to lean horizontally across the couch. Slowly, just in case he was doing something wrong, or someone became uncomfortable, or they changed their minds, he leaned back. And when no one spoke up or yelled at him, he settled, leaning so his lower back was across Azui's legs, and his head ended up in Uraraka's lap. There was another pause, far more awkward this time, or maybe that was just because Tenya was experiencing casual teenage social interaction involving touch, which he had never been good at. You can relax Uraraka said with a slight giggle and a smile. I am perfectly relaxed. Tenya said, still rigid as a board, waving his arm in chopping motions, Did you actually get held by your parents? Azui asked, blinking down at him. Suddenly Ida wasn't the only stiff one in the room. Tenya swallowed, feeling eyes on him. I don't see how that has anything to do with, Tenya's words fell off somewhere along the line, his mind reeling, trying to remember the last time he was actually hugged by a family member. Sure, his brother and some of his other family would give him the occasional hair ruffle, maybe if he had a nightmare they'd give a hug, but really? But they were a hero family, they didn't always have time for things like that. Don't worry, Todoroki said. Tenya did his best to crane his neck to see the boy's expression, but it was of no use. I'm the same way, Todoroki admitted, casually nodding at the idea of simple neglect. God, Bokugu snarled, I didn't know I entered the wussiest therapy session ever. Says the one with Kirishima basically draped across you like a blanket, Ashido exclaimed, crossing her arms. From where she was also half draped across Aoyama, both fiddling with glitter pens. You fucking pink beach, Bokugu yelled, you wanna come over here and dash? Come on guys, no fighting, said Yaoyorozu, her voice moving closer as she spoke. Part of Tenya was quite glad she was there to handle the situation because he wasn't really sure if he wanted to get up. Something about the casual touch was really nice. He felt Azui shift, leaning closer into him, her arm brushing his. She did feel cold to the touch, Azui, Tenya asked, debating whether or not he should ask before giving into the curiosity. Why did you ask? He was almost afraid to know the answer. Was it that obvious that he was bad at being social? You just seem very self-conscious about touch, Azui said in her usual, nasal and blunt fashion. Kind of like Midoriya-kun used to be. Yeah, Uraraka said with a smile, but he's gotten a lot better. Add that to the list of things Midoriya was better than me at, Tenya thought self-consciously. But hey, it takes time, Uraraka said, patting his head gently. He tried not to lean into the touch. He failed only seconds later. Oh, Ida, your hair is so soft, Uraraka said, carting her fingers through his thick hair, her long nails tracing against his scalp, sending gentle tingles down his spine. He closed his eyes. Thank you, Ida muttered gently, his cheeks flushing gently. He was thankful no one commented on it. He did lean a little further against her though, still rigid and tight in his motions, but steadier. And as Uraraka continued to card through his hair, he slowly did relax, not realizing how much stress he'd really been holding until it was melting from his shoulders. And it was nice. There's blood on the floor. Izuku can feel as it drips out of him. The cold sensation of the air, the hot, bruising pain of everything else. He'd always had a strong sense of justice, one that made him do stupid things sometimes, he'd admit. And, following that pattern, he idiotically, bravely, a strong, feminine voice in his mind corrects, startling him surprisingly little did not back down from opposing evil deeds. His brother brother? His mind skips like a record. He doesn't have a brother, but he does, doesn't he? But, had come to his wit's end, and now, he was here. To end his rebellion against him, his older brother who had always been stronger, even before discovering his ability. Quirks, they were calling them. A new advantage in natural selection attempted to get him to submit by giving him a quirk all his own. He didn't know you already had one. A low, manly whispers, the tone is vaguely playful like he knows what's gonna happen, like he's rewatching an old favorite movie and grinning at the plot twists. Quiet, Daigoro, that feminine voice chides, only halfway seeming to mean it. The low, manly voice scoffs, but doesn't speak beyond that. Dear brother, a low, far more real voice spoke. Breath hot and close. He could feel his brother's hand grip around his throat, his white teeth and hair glinting in the light. His wide build easily lifting Izuku's tall, frail body by his neck, his legs dangle, toes barely scraping the ground. You always have to play the hero, don't you? His brother snarled. Izuku didn't want to dignify it with a response, he didn't even really know what was happening, but everything in him told that this man was not to be trusted. And yet, his mouth moved without himself. The true owner of body he was in that he was gaining more and more awareness that it wasn't his taking over. You won't get away with this, his voice came out lower, gravelier than Izuku could remember his own sounding. White. Since when was his hair white? But it had always been white, it matched his brother's. The brother that wasn't his, hair fell over his eyes, sticking to his forehead with sweat. Real original, one of the other disembodied voices said with a laugh, scratchy and raw. Because of that Izuku missed whatever the white-haired man said first, only catching the tail end. Well, this will teach you. Suddenly, Izuku was choking. Not just because he was literally being lifted off the ground by his neck, no, this was, somehow, worse. A glow, a sickly color crawls down his brother's arm, and up his throat, into his mouth. It tasted like spoiled milk and wine. Bile rose in his throat at the force, but the feeling the quirk being forced into his unprepared system forced it down. And being given a quirk, especially when it's non-CNSNS, hurt. A lot. The feeling burnt and cut in, like a scalpel, opening his skin, flesh, like a zipper dragging down. He screams and chokes at his brother to stop, but one of his brother's many quirks continues to hold him immobile, barely able to groan at the hold it has on his senses. This is his punishment, for being quirkless. For being born wrong. For being so goddamn weak. This is his punishment for trying to be a hero despite it. It hurts, his body is certainly not made for this, but it's happening anyway, because since when did fate care if he was ready? Then he's tumbling from that grip and crashing further to the floor. Long white hair falls over his eyes again. His hands reach out and grip the cool tile floor they're longer, paler than he remembers. Blood still pools around him, he coughs some of it up, choking slightly. This is what pain feels like, Izuku knows it well. He can hear his brother not his brother, but it is, walking away, his dress shoes click on the tile, the the rhythm matches his deep laughter, his stocky build and suit becoming nothing more than an inky stain on the gray sky, and then he's gone. The disembodied voices swirl around his brain, speaking. Introducing themselves, maybe, but he really can't hear them. This is awakening. The thought isn't his, but it skips everything else in this dream to a startling halt. Awakening of what? He wants to ask. More questions follow quickly. What just happened? Where am I? Why do I feel like this body isn't mine? One question rises slightly above the others. Is this a dream? He wants to ask. He doesn't really have an answer, because it can't be a dream, and yet, what else could it be? No, this is too visceral to be just a dream. He can feel the quirk his brother gave him still at all crawling sourly down his esophagus, the feeling inches like worms through his veins, writhing and creating bumps under his skin, protruding and forcing itself inside of him, like thousands of larvae and maggots that force their way down his throat. The feeling of acidic bile burns and bites at his throat as his stomach tries desperately to pump it all out, the war inside him, the quirk trying to slither its way in, his body rejecting it. He tries to just swallow it down, and for a moment it almost works. Hey, I don't remember this part, that deep manly, disembodied voice asks again. Daigoro, he faintly remembers the name. His assuredness, like watching an old favorite movie only to realize this ending isn't the same as it always has been. The worms and maggots and larvae in his throat choke him, squirming and writhing. It's nauseating, and the bile pushes further yet again, and this time it comes up. He squeezes his eyes closed to try and force it back, but he's choking on it. That strong feminine voice swears, hands lift him. Light surrounds him, and Izuku feels weightless. It's hard to really feel anything. It feels so much like how his mom would hold him when he was sick, her arms so soft and sturdy, gentle in a way that he instinctively curls toward, away from the nausea and the pain. Izuku wrenches his eyes open to try and grasp what the hell is going on, trying. Shimura, what do we do? An older, silver-haired man says in panic, even he seems frail, and Izuku barely holds on to the strength to keep his eyes open. Watching the man as he flits about the odd dark space nervously, but something about looking at the man is like looking in the mirror. I don't know, another disembodied voice says fretfully. We really need to wake him up. So this is a dream, he thinks. That explains very little, actually. His mind is still swirling with questions, not helped by his heart that pounds in his ears. Funny, he's been choking for at least 30 seconds now. Usually he'd be. It's not a dream, kid. Well, not really, Shimura says with a smile, either successfully reading his mind or just guesstimating his thoughts on the situation impressively well. Izuku tries to speak, to ask more, to learn more because something about him knows that this is way too important an opportunity to miss, but his heart rate just keeps spiking. He feels sort of like he's drowning in molasses, the oxygen deprivation seemingly taking a longer time to kick in than it should, but it's still slowly making his head feel like an expanding balloon, primed and ready to pop. Don't you think we would have woken him up already if we knew how? One of the other voices exclaims in a rather sharp panic. Yeah, another agrees, he needed to know about One for All's origin, but this shouldn't be fucking reliving torture. This is One for All? Does that mean these are spirits? The past users of One for All maybe? But the last time he remembered interacting with them was breaking out of Shinsu's control at the sports festival. So why now? What? Guys, get it in gear. The kid's still choking. Django reminds sharply, I know time is different here but we don't have forever. Right, one of them, the white-haired frail man snaps up. What about we do it like the sports festival? So long as we don't break bones this time. Okay, yeah, Shimura says with a nod. That confirms it, these are the past users. God, he wishes he had more time to ask them questions, but he's pretty sure another minute of this and his head is gonna blow. Shimura turns back to Izuku. Sorry kid, she says. He tries to tell her that it's okay, but he is still choking, even if the feeling doesn't really feel like his right now. Suddenly, weight has an effect on him, and the nausea doubles, then triples. His eyes wrench shut as he jolts violently. His throat constricts. Hands, strong ones, guide him and roll him to his side as he retches once, twice, his fingers, clammy and hot, find purchase on a metal bucket that's handed to him, and he empties his stomach into it. He gasps for air between violent coughs and seizing retches. He can feel someone rubbing at his back through the thin material of his sweatshirt. He coughs, trying his best to ignore the vile taste of the bile as it keeps coming up. Then, after another long moment, eyes watering from the pained force of his body's convulsions, he looks up. He blinks. All might? Izuku asks, blurry eyes first making out the blurry blonde figure. Then the darker one. Aizawa-sensei? He asks, his throat raw and aching. They're standing over him, close, wearing somehow matching expressions of relief. "Take it easy, my boy," All Might says gently. Giving him another moment before taking the bucket obile from his clammy hands, Izuku tries to bow, or wipe at his watery eyes to see better, but Aizawa-sensei doesn't let him, on him in a second with a glass of water in hand. "Sit up and drink," slowly, Aizawa-sensei orders, clasping his shoulder and leaning him back. Moving his pillow so it's upright against the headrest, then leaning him, sternly but gently, so he was sitting back against it. He recognizes the smell, sterile and sunny, the feeling of the bed, which is a kinda sad thing to know by feel as one in Recovery Girl's office. "How are you feeling?" Aizawa said, already brushing some of Izuku's unruly, sweaty green hair off from where it stuck to his forehead. Izuku debated between responding and not, and decided recovering his water reserves felt a little more important right now. So he just sort of took slow sips from the drink and hoped Aizawa-sensei understood. The feeling of his teacher's cool, rough hand pressed to his forehead, and Izuku tried not to hum at the pleasant sensation. Still leaning into the cool sensation of hydration slipping down his throat pleasantly, soothing the irritation. "He's got a fever," Aizawa-sensei reported blandly. Izuku slowly opened his eyes to the bright lights of the medical office, tilting his head back as, even taking his time, he had quickly polished off his drink. Aizawa-sensei dotingly set it on the side table. Before All Might could say any sort of response, the door slid open, revealing a more casually dressed Recovery Girl, who looked around the room, seeing All Might washing out a bucket into the medical sink, seeing Aizawa not quite holding his student down, and sighed. "I leave for 5 minutes, she grumbled gently, not really seeming to mean it. That didn't mean Izuku didn't shy away. He was no stranger to her odd form of maternal, wrathful nature. She tugged her lab coat from where it had been thrown across the back of her chair, then moved to Izuku's side. "He's definitely got a fever," Aizawa-sensei offered. Quickly, rubbing at his own eyes to relieve the dry and tired feeling. Recovery Girl hummed, lifting her small hand and resting the back of it against his forehead. Izuku just stared forcefully at the pale blankets he'd been tucked under, fiddling with the edge. "Well, after our checkup he was still wearing an entire sweatsuit," Recovery Girl commented, "and he was tucked under 3 blankets, she commented. Izuku nodded. "Why yeah, Izuku said with a forced smile, "Oh, other than that I feel okay dash. And he just threw up," All Might said. Izuku shot him a somewhat betrayed look. All Might just sort of shrugged, and everyone in the room pretended not to hear Aizawa's slight chuckle at the interaction. He also seemed to activate his quirk in his sleep. Izuku blanked at that. "I did?" "Yes," All Might and Aizawa said in unison. Well, that explained why they looked so worried. Recovery Girl said, "Well, other than his quirk activating in his sleep, none of that odd for such a concussion," she commented, pulling out a stethoscope and swiftly tucking it under his shirt. The cool disc metal pressed to his chest, and Izuku tried to keep his breathing even. "Sometimes symptoms like this can be related to vestibular DSFNCTN though," she muttered, seemingly to herself, but Aizawa was nodding along. "But it can also be associated with migraine." Recovery Girl returned the stethoscope to its place around her neck, then lifted her hand. "Follow my finger, dearie," Recovery Girl said, dragging her finger back and forth across his visual field, slowly, then up and down, without moving his head. "Very good," she nodded. Pulling out her penlight. She shined it into his eyes, and Izuku flinched slightly at the brightness. "Dilation is normal," she muttered, nodding. "Any new pain?" "No ma'am," he said, shaking his head, then immediately regretting it due to the sharp twinge in his neck. "Any changes from when I healed you? Ringing in your ears? Headache?" "No," Izuku answered honestly. "But I was wondering, how long have I been here? I remember talking with Nedzu, and All Might Sensei bringing me to your office," he said, pausing for confirmation, waiting to see if somehow his memory deteriorated. But the whole room nodded, so he continued. "And I remember you going over my injuries? Did I pass out?" "Yes, dearie," Recovery Girl said with a nod. "We all figured you needed your rest, so I tucked you in." Midoriya paused for a moment. "It's been about 2 hours," Aizawa-sensei answered curtly, holding up his hand before Izuku could ask his next question. "The reason I'm here is because your classmate sent me," he said solidly, to which Izuku's jaw quickly clicked shut. "Apparently they've been fretting so much that they will not go to sleep. So, since I'm pretty sure that if I'd ordered them all to bed, they'd be staging a coup, I made a deal that if I brought word of your condition back, they'd all go straight to bed." Izuku let out a slight laugh at that, sobering quickly. "Can I see them? After we finish making sure you're all right, maybe," Recovery Girl said with a hum of impatience. Sorry," Izuku said, quickly turning back to her. "Now," she said, "have you been experiencing any unusual amounts of anxiety or stress?" Izuku thought for a moment, He knew that jumping into the middle of a quirk-based school shooting wasn't exactly soothing, but no more than usual, he concluded honestly. Alrighty, Recovery Girl said, last question. When you were asleep, did you have any kind of odd dream that could have caused your quirk to react? Izuku paused, staring rather forcefully at his bandaged wrist. He swallowed, the feeling of that quirk, worm-like and writhing down his throat. Sort of. He looked up, finding All Might's eyes, then looking away just quickly. Not quick enough though, but that was good, it got his point across, even if it felt like he'd been caught with his wrist wedged in the cookie jar. But, he gripped the sheets, loose at first but balled fists grew tight. I'd really like to just go back to my dorm now. He hoped he was making it clear, just how tired he was. Because really, all he wanted to do right now was go back to normal, or whatever passed as normal in his life. To rest and recover, and maybe even puzzle out pieces of that vision, dream, thing. Please. He whispered. The overhead lights flickered in the silence, buzzing. A sigh followed shortly. Well, I was going to suggest that you stay here overnight, since a quirk as powerful as yours activating unconsciously could be very dangerous, Recovery Girl said with a long-standing sigh, watching as Izuku curled in on himself with every word. But? Izuku perked up slightly. So long as you promise to tell someone if you have any other symptoms, I suppose I can allow you to return to your dormitory. Izuku looked up, blinking, almost as if he expected her not to listen to him at all. Thank you, Recovery Girl-sama, he exclaimed, bowing as much as he reasonably dared, given his injuries and the remnants of his nausea. I'll take you back to your dorms, All Might offered immediately. It was obvious what was going to happen, that All Might expected an explanation on the way back. And Izuku nodded, even if he had no idea how he'd offer one. Izuku wasn't sure if this situation could get more complicated. And I'll join you, Aizawa-sensei said with a nod and a low grumble, rubbing at his tired, reddened eyes, if only because I don't trust your classmates not to burn the place down if I don't. All Might and Izuku shared a look as Aizawa-sensei gathered his things. Izuku swallowed. He shouldn't jinxed it. Izuku's legs ached slightly as he kept his walking speed to match that of his taller teachers. He swallowed slightly, the taste of bile still tingling at the back of his throat, still slightly raw. Thankfully though, after puking his guts out, Izuku's stomach had settled. His soreness and lethargy from the long day, and Recovery Girl's healing session, wearing him down. He had to be thankful though. The hallways were so much quieter at night. It wasn't a shocking fact, not by any means. But it was far kinder on his headache than bright lights or noise would be. The windows were cool with the glow of night, the dim light joining the LEDs that lined the bottom of the hallways, gently lighting their way, even though it did end up drawing shrewd, gaunt shadows against walls and darker corners. Izuku idly wondered if the eerie ambience was planned or accidental, if the rather ominous, lanky shadows had been planned into the architecture. A way to deter would-be attackers, or nighttime troublemakers, perhaps. Izuku's fingers twitched with the urge to write these thoughts down. He could learn a lot from the school's security systems, and, hypothetically of course, how he would go about getting past them. As far as he could tell, the lights on the floor worked as a sort of laser grid, with keypads at either end of the building that Aizawa-sensei had plugged in his teaching ID and how many people he was with. So if he had some sort of way to hover above the floor, but then again, he was sure that wasn't the only security feature. Perhaps some sort of heat or motion sensors? Izuku knew there were cameras in nearly every hallway, classroom, well, everywhere excluding dorm rooms and bathrooms, and a select few office rooms, but surely Nedzu would have thought through some sort of shut-off just in case the camera station were in some way compromised. A way to move undetected through the school, and/or hide within it, secret rooms perhaps. Walkways under the building? He wondered if there were some kind of official blueprints Izuku could access. Most building blueprints are a matter of public record of course, but for security purposes he was sure Nedzu would have them obfuscated. Still. Midoriya, my boy, All Might said, jarring Izuku from his thoughts, are you sure you're alright to walk? All Might said dotingly, Aizawa watching him carefully from his other side. Izuku then realized that he was a solid 3 steps behind them, and quickly jogged to catch up, rubbing at the back of his neck to fight the embarrassment of getting lost in his thoughts. Again. I am fine All Might. Izuku said, smiling at his mentor nervously, watching the careful slump of his mentor's shoulders, feeling the impertinence of Aizawa-sensei's stare. They don't believe you. A voice in his head whispered, it didn't feel demeaning or hurtful, just factual. I'm just tired, it's kinda been a long day, Izuku said, trying to swallow the churning feeling his chest gave as All Might nodded, and Aizawa-sensei grunted, but only seconds later when they presumed he was no longer paying attention they shared a look. Reaching a doorway, Aizawa-sensei sliding his teacher's ID under the scanner and unlocking the sizable metal door. They pushed through it and into the quiet night. It was the truth, though. It had been a long day, and he was just tired. For the most part at least. But he couldn't deny that he also felt something else. It was subtle, almost imperceptible if Izuku hadn't been examining his own body so closely, remembering the vision so viscerally, wondering how it had affected his real body so greatly. But that infinitesimal feeling was still there, buzzing around him like static. It felt like he was standing above the tree line just before a large storm, clouds gray and wind urging him quickly to find cover in safe ground. Except the storm was inside him. It was an odd feeling, like being in danger, something Izuku was used to, while being said danger. Problem child, Aizawa-sensei said, the words solid and low even as the haze of the night surrounded them. Izuku blinked at his teacher. They were only a short distance from the dorms, but Aizawa-sensei's steps had slowed. What's wrong? And nothing. Izuku exclaimed, jumping slightly and shaking his arms. Aizawa-sensei just rubbed at his tired eyes, stopping his walking and wincing slightly as the motion-activated lights out front of the dorms flicked on. All Might placed a warm hand on Izuku's shoulder. Midoriya, my boy, All Might said, stopping where he stood, squeezing his shoulder firmly, but still gentle, you know you can tell us anything, right? All Might, I told you, I'm okay. Izuku said, trying to sound as solid as possible in that statement. All Might's hand slid off from his shoulder. Izuku really didn't want to deal with people fretting over him. It was on the growing list of things he really was not a fan of. Right up there with large crowds and getting yelled at for breaking bones. And yet, Aizawa-sensei said, clearly unimpressed with his words, you keep acting like you expect every other wall to collapse on you, or every shadow to lurch out and grab you. He crossed his arms. You're jumpy, and dash. To be fair, I'm always, he gestured to himself, like this, Izuku said with a light-hearted laugh, betraying the almost unnerving smoothness of the words. The unnerving sharpness of how anxiety-ridden he always had been. Izuku's chin tilts upward a fraction of an inch, his breathing smoothing out, and for just a moment, under the amber light, he looks entirely different. All Might blinked a little harshly at that. But before Aizawa could retort, Izuku looked him directly in the eyes. What about you? Izuku asks with a totally uncharacteristic amount of ease to his words, then turning to look at All Might for a swift moment, because questioning works best when people aren't expecting it, and based on his teacher's looks, they were not expecting it. Midoriya? All Might said slowly. But Aizawa says nothing. Their eyes burn, confusion flaring, concern, the exact kinds of worry he was trying to snuff written all over their features. Suddenly there's an itch in his throat. He coughs slightly, shoulders, posture slumping as he does so. A breeze rushes through, tangling through his messy hair and the flurry of autumn leaves. I know I worry you, Izuku says softly, his tone back to his normal shift, but... He looks at Aizawa. Both of you? I just dash, he pauses. I've done reckless stuff like this before. Izuku says, and he knows his teachers can't deny that much. And they nod. If there's a such thing as being well practiced at being unprepared, at being caught in unexpected trouble, I think I've got it, Izuku says, gesturing vividly with his hands. Heck dash, Izuku says, throwing his arms in the air for emphasis, I didn't even break any bones this time. I'm basically unscathed. He can tell they disagree with that, but he pushes on. So, why are you acting like this? Like I'm suddenly so frail and, he gestured to both of them, but said nothing more. Kid, Aizawa-sensei just runs a slow hand down his face, your standard of being okay shouldn't be not being in a full body cast, he says. You're deflecting. Izuku points out, tone practiced and cold. I'm making a point, Aizawa says strongly. He rubs at his eyes again, taking a step closer to Izuku, but only a step. Kid, you, dash. My boy, All Might says, his words gentle, but they cut through Aizawa's rough ones like a cleaver. Yes, you've done dangerous things before, All Might says slowly, taking another step toward Izuku, but you were alone this time, and as your teacher, and your mentor, I fear that, All Might said, in a rare moment of emotional vulnerability. I fear losing you, a lot. Izuku felt the raw feeling claw up behind his eyes, the familiar sting of tears he tried to hold at bay. But Aizawa-sensei nodded from just behind All Might. You shouldn't had to do that alone, Aizawa-sensei said, repeating what he'd said in the car. This time, Izuku didn't argue it immediately. I get that, I think, Izuku said, crossing his arms, his posture still somewhat defensive, but thoughtful. But I'm okay. Izuku promised. All Might leaned down towards him, his thin arms wrapping around Izuku, his warmth immediate and close. And I am more glad about that than you may ever know, my boy, All Might said, his voice a low rumble that Izuku could feel in his mentor's thin ribcage. His thin, yet firm arms embracing Izuku tightly. Izuku barely tried to fight it as his tears welled in his eyes, clinging to his lashes before finally running down his cheeks. There was a hollow center to Izuku's chest, a feeling he could usually escape by getting a hug like this, or a good cry. But Izuku lifted his good wrist to wipe at his eyes, trying to rid them of the burning sensation. It didn't really work, as more tears well up in their place, all thanks to his body's rather fantastic survival instinct of cry until the threat is gone, even when there really wasn't a threat to speak of. All Might reluctantly pulled away a few long moments later, his hands still tucked over his shoulders. The cool night's air bleeds silkily into his senses, and Izuku wipes his eyes again. Sorry, Izuku sniffled quietly. He looked toward Aizawa-sensei, who seemed to just be waiting. Paused only slightly uncomfortably. Izuku flushed and let out a sort of nervous laugh, having to bite down his tongue to not apologize for taking up his teacher's time. Izuku tried awkwardly. Let's just get you inside, kid, Aizawa-sensei said, rolling his eyes and taking the lead for the few steps and stairs it took to get them to the door. Why yes sensei, Izuku said, bowing and jogging to keep close. All Might matched them with his naturally long stride, until they were at the door. Aizawa swiped his teacher's ID card, as did All Might, who succinctly pulled open the door. Now, especially knowing how his classmates had swarmed him as he got out of the car earlier that day, Izuku knew that he was going to be mobbed as soon as he got back to the dorms. He didn't have to like it, but he knew it. So, before he entered and to be most efficient while Ida would be proud, Izuku bowed to his teachers first. Thank you for escorting me, All Might sensei, Aizawa-sensei, he said, as quiet as he could physically make his voice. Just get some rest, kid, Aizawa-sensei said, arms crossed and waiting. All Might nodded to that sentiment, and, with a gentle hand on Izuku's shoulder blade, guided him inside. Izuku swallowed. It was mostly quiet in the main dorm area, but the quiet sound from the TV rerunning some kind of news report was not enough to cloak the quiet muttering from people. He had kind of hoped that his classmates would have gone to bed before he got back, but he hadn't been stupid enough to expect it. He balled his fists, which had grown clammy with nervousness, and tried to remind himself that they were his friends. They just wanted to make sure he was okay. He took another step, then another. But his feet stopped short, never even making a sound. The coldness that spread around his senses didn't budge. The hollow feeling in the center of his chest doesn't wane. Izuku paused, lifting a hand to his chest for a moment. He could still feel Aizawa-sensei standing behind him, the same with All Might. Watching him. But there was another feeling to it too. Not just the cold clammy feeling that could be explained by his mild social anxiety. Not just the pounding of his heart or the hollow feeling in his chest that could be explained by trauma. There's something else here. It was an odd sensation, not unlike the static, storm-like sensation he'd felt earlier. Only now, he could hear it. It was just at the edges of it too, and focusing in on it almost stung. The sound was like hearing someone twitching between radio stations in a far-off room, at full volume, almost a shriek of static that ached through his brain. Izuku clenched his fist, the familiar feeling filling his chest and head for barely a split second, kind of like One for All, and yet, completely different. A light bulb in the corner of the room explodes, shattering into a million twinkling pieces that shards fall to the floor. Denki, I swear to God! Jairu shouted violently, breaking the quiet peace that had seemed to swallow the main area. If I find you with your tongue in a wall socket again, I swear I'm gonna dash. It wasn't me. Kaminari exclaimed from somewhere in the kitchen. I was literally just making toast. And just as suddenly as the feeling came, it was gone. A light bulb in the corner of the room explodes, shattering into a million twinkling pieces that shards fall to the floor. Shoto looked up toward the sound. Denki, I swear to God! Jairu shouted violently, breaking the quiet peace of the main area and startling several of her classmates. If I find you with your tongue in a wall socket again, I swear I'm gonna dash. It wasn't me. Kaminari exclaimed from somewhere in the kitchen. I was literally just making toast. Why are you making toast? Sato asked, munching on one of the chocolate chip cookies that had been set out on the coffee table. Yeah, we literally put out snacks, Uraraka said, gesturing to the treats in front of them, the smell a slightly underwhelming mixture of sweet and salty gas station snacks. Shoto grabbed a handful of chips from the large, crinkly bag. Sour cream and onion flavor, before handing them to Ida, who was still laying out over her lap, who took them with a small thanks. Shoto brushed the crumbs off his hands. I wanted to have some Nutella. Kaminari said defensively, his voice getting louder as he emerged from the kitchen with 2 pieces of toast on a wobbly paper plate. He sat down with a thunk, crossing his legs and grabbing the container of Nutella from where it had been set on the coffee table. I didn't think it was a crime dash. You eat Nutella on toast? Uraraka asked, as if this were a personal affront. Shoto blinked up at her. Personally, he'd never had Nutella, but based on what he'd heard, toast seemed like a perfectly reasonable way to eat it. Yes? Kaminari said without looking up, seeming similarly confounded, holding his small plastic knife tight as he scraped around the edges of the Nutella container. How else would I dash? With a spoon. Uraraka said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world, like a normal person. Oh my god, Bokugu swore from where he was still trapped under a sprawled-out Kirishima. Round cheeks, UFING, Bokugu exclaimed violently, grumbling into his hand before exclaiming, it's a spread. Not a kind of pudding. You can't just FING eat it like rice. Uraraka, unbothered by Bokugu's outburst, just crossed her arms, keeping her shoulders raised so her elbows didn't hit Ida's glasses. Yeah, it can be a spread, but Uraraka was cut off when Kirishima lifted his free hand, the other busy keeping an awkward grip on his hot chocolate. I gotta side with Bokubro here, Kirishima said with a strong nod. How shocking, Azui said with a slight laugh. Uraraka chuckled with her, taking the moment to card her fingers through Ida's hair again, the usually rigid man almost totally melting into her touch. No, seriously. Kirishima waved his hand, it's called a hazelnut cocoa spread, it says it on the bottle and everything. Yaoyorozu paused from where she'd been reading, shutting the thick, leather-bound book in her hand with a soft thunk. Shoto looked at her, watching her expression shift through different brands of confusion, before settling on simple puzzlement. Did you just call it a bottle? Yeah, Kaminari said, W-. Based on the structure of the container, Yaoyorozu said, I think calling it a jar would be more fitting, I mean dash. Todoroki-kun, Azui said gently, cutting through the discourse that continued around them, at least to him. Shoto looked up toward her, head tilted in gentle query. Could you grab me a glass of water, Karo? Shoto nodded and stood. He was only barely listening into the debate over what classified things as bottles versus jars, which Ida chimed into surprisingly little, even as the conversation skewed more toward classifications of other types of containers. Shoto idly wondered if this debating was just an odd way to let off steam, or if it was a legitimate thing that his classmates were getting heated over. In all honesty, it was hard to tell. He grabbed one of the glasses from the cabinet, and pulled a glass out, nimbly leaning to dodge a thrown object that came at him with such force and several loud curse words behind it that it had to have come from Bokugu. The object in question, a thick leather-bound book, somehow ricocheting off, and leaving a dent in two of the wooden cabinets. It fell to the ground with a loud thunk. Yaoyorozu's then scolding of Bokugu confirmed that he'd been the one to throw the book. As well as Bokugu's barking that they needed to stop their dumb FING nerd match before his head or their heads, as the furious blonde threatened succinctly exploded. Bokugu was a bit like an aggressive Pomeranian sometimes. Only with the power to blow things up. Not quite as personable as a puppy either. Shoto was moderately sure he'd have more potential as a hero if he were more pup-like too, as well as if his personality weren't a train wreck that just kept crashing. With a tall, cool glass of water in his hand, the condensation slicking up his grip, Shoto moved to return to the couches. Pardon me Aoyama, Shoto said, scooting by the boy who seemed hyper-focused on adding glitter to some kind of drawing. Oh. Apologies Mon Ami, Aoyama said, pushing himself closer to the counter but never taking his eyes off the paper. Midoriya smiled at them tightly. Oh, hello Midoriya, Shoto said in calm greeting, turning and taking a few steps before suddenly stutter-stepping. Water sloshed onto his knuckles as the world seemed to grind to a sudden, inexplicable halt. He whipped his head back to see Midoriya, just standing there, shifting between his footing as if he'd been standing there for a while, but hadn't quite known what to do. Midoriya waved awkwardly with his non-bandaged wrist. The entire room's conversation screeched to a halt, like a train skipping off the tracks, 10 tons of metal just tipping and careening to an explosive end. Midoriya? Someone dared to ask. It was hard to tell who among the slow shuffle to stand. The entire class stood, solid and staring, but hesitant, receding like the ocean before a tsunami. Shoto placed the glass of water down on the counter with a gentle clink. Pausing as if waiting for some kind of proof, something to tell him he wasn't dreaming, or that this wasn't some kind of mass hallucination. Hey, Midoriya said awkwardly, an arm crossing over his torso, which was slumped tightly in on himself. He looked exhausted, not in a lack-of-sleep way, but in a way that reminded Shoto a lot of when he'd come back from his father's training sessions. Moreover, as Midoriya shifted his weight from foot to foot, he looked incredibly uncomfortable, probably at being the center of attention. Sorry I took so long. Suddenly, that giant wave crashed down. A stampede of concerned soon-to-be heroes, all using any means possible to get to Midoriya, vaulting all sorts of furniture, leaping over the backs of couches and chairs and tables to reach him quicker. Shoto dodged several bodies, quirks, and violent motions. A loud chorus of some form of Deku, Izuku, or Midoriya shouting from all around. Loud enough it was hard to tell one concerned exclamation from another, even as they reached him. What on earth happened? Why were you gone so long? Kirishima exclaimed. Dude, you saved so many people. Shiro exclaimed violently, but what the hell were you thinking? You could have died in there. You managed exceedingly well under the circumstances, Yaoyorozu quipped quickly, Shoto barely catching her words amongst the crowd that had swamped Midoriya, but it was incredibly irresponsible to do such a thing. Why did you go in there alone? Shoto asked, even though his question went unheard amongst the din. Ida echoed his question, though a bit more viscerally. Taking Midoriya by the shoulders and shaking him. You worried us sick. Ida exclaimed, why didn't you call the pros before charging in there? That was so irresponsible. Even as heroes in training. We dash. Soon the exclamations became too much to decipher, all melding into one long stream of worry. If you ever do that again I swear dash. Did you end up breaking anything? Why were you gone so long? What did Nedzu want from you? Is everything okay? Are you in trouble? Dekakuin, you really worried us. Azui exclaimed, Uraraka nodding closely behind. I am sorry. I didn't mean to, honest. Izuku said, frantically waving his hands. Something about the nervous motion didn't quite seem right though. Midoriya continued to reply to his friend's questions with short, non-specific, fretful answers. Though he did end up telling them that, no, he wasn't in trouble, and that Nedzu had apparently just wanted to fill him in on some details before he got checked out by Recovery Girl. And he went on easily though, accepting teary-eyed hugs and tokens of welcoming, a lukewarm cup of hot chocolate that had been saved for him as well as an open invitation to any of the snacks they'd set out. He was even handed 2 separate cards of brightly colored paper, one "Get Well Soon" and one "Congratulations," with signatures and still tacky glitter glue on them, which somehow managed to get all over Midoriya's hands. On the congratulations card, someone had written how happy they were he didn't break any bones this time, which everyone got a good chuckle at. But something about it just didn't seem right. Even as All Might and Aizawa-sensei chatted in the background, All Might shaking his fellow teacher's hand and exiting, presumably to head back to get some rest before the school day tomorrow. And it didn't seem like Shoto had been the only one to notice that something was up. Aizawa-sensei, leaning heavily against the doorframe, simply watched and waited, tapping his foot against the hardwood floors. Bokugo, who'd been hanging back the whole time, also seemed to notice. Shoto watched the explosive blonde for a long moment, evaluating his expressions, his movements, the telltale cross of his arms, and most importantly, the way that even though he was still huffing, occasionally muttering about how stupid everyone looked, fawning over dumb Deku, Bokugo nonetheless kept close to the crowd of students, almost leaning into every word Midoriya spoke. And when Midoriya smiled, it wasn't hard to see the droop in everyone's shoulders, the collective sigh of relief to see the boy healthy, happy, and grinning. Shoto turned away for a moment, unable to stop his own slight smile at the sight. Even if looking at the freckled boy directly felt like it was gonna give him skin cancer, maybe even blind him. But that was who Midoriya Izuku was. And if Aizawa-sensei broke them up only moments later, their teacher quick to part the tides of his crowding class and tell them all to hit the hay. There had of course been objections, people exclaiming that Midoriya had only just gotten back, and they needed to know why he was gone for so long, but they were quickly silenced with one, sharp and truly terrifying look from Eraserhead. He wasn't an underground pro for no reason, at least. So they all eventually parted, making their way back to their rooms and tucking in for the night. And if something about Midoriya's sunny smile had felt like deflection, like shining a bright light into an opponent's eye to blind them for a moment, then it worked. But that didn't mean that those who noticed wouldn't bring it up later. Izuku was glad that Aizawa-sensei had come along after all. Even though he hadn't gotten to explain his vision thing to All Might on the walk over, no one had quite the power for dispersing energetic teenagers as Aizawa-sensei. So here Izuku was. Nearly 11 o'clock at night. His body hitting the mattress pretty much as soon as he kicked the door shut, barely having enough energy to shirk off his shoes and socks, and tug off his pants and sweatshirt before curling under the covers. The cool, silken sensation shifted over his tired skin and bandaged wounds. He knew he'd regret a lot in the morning, like not checking his bandages, well as not brushing his teeth, or showering, but relaxing into the plush sensation of the mattress was just too tempting. He pulled the familiar All Might-themed, star-spangled duvet up to his nose, inhaling the sweet, cotton smell of his detergent and exhaling into the feeling. He practically melted into his mattress, waiting for sleep to take him. And he waited. And waited. Izuku shifted, rolling over and tucking himself tighter under the covers. He could hear the faint sound of crickets from outside, the the creaks and shifting of the dorms as his friends either got ready for bed or feigned sleep. He shifted again, doing his best to get comfortable, not budging his wounds too much. And yet even so, the restlessness that buzzed under his skin barely waned. The aching lethargy of an extremely long day having not quite melted away, but molded him into the mattress. He was comfortable, a little warm if anything, but his mind just kept reeling. Eyes flickering among the moonlit shadow. The eyes of his posters almost seemed to glow in that darkness, the sheen of protective plastic on his prized, collector's editions glinting, barely visible in the dimness. He tried to ignore what that dimness reminded him of. The iron stench of blood, being trapped. The hollow feeling in his chest that lingered. Izuku is still beyond tired the next morning, his eyes blinking slow and temples throbbing from the usually rejuvenating, too bright sunshine that gleamed through his open curtains. He was pretty sure he managed to fall asleep at some point, though he was rather unsure when, but it had felt like only seconds later when Ida had been diligently knocking at his door, informing him that he would miss breakfast if he slept much longer. He had grunted out some sort of assent, and whatever it had been seemed enough for Ida, as, after a rather long moment of Izuku dragging himself from his bed, he heard the class rep's footsteps pad evenly back toward the stairs. Izuku, to put it gently, felt like sheet. His exhaustion clung to his bones with every movement, a physical weight that slumped his shoulders and dragged with his feet across carpet and tile, tossing on his uniform with barely enough care to bother fixing it when he realized he'd done up his buttons one off. Still, even exhausted, he did make it through the motions of mourning, somewhat thankful to get the bathroom to himself, even if it was due to his tardiness. He barely looked in the mirror, even as he checked his bandages, making sure they weren't too prominent under his uniform, adjusting his hair as best he could to camouflage the one still wrapped around his forehead. He brushed his teeth and rinsed dull, bitter taste from his mouth. He barely tried combing his hair or doing his tie, instead letting the red strip of fabric hang loosely around his neck. He wondered if he'd get in trouble for it, even if Kaken pretty much never even wore a tie at all, but then again when had the rules applied to Katsuki Bokugu? Izuku padded downstairs, his temples aching slightly in the brightness of the corridor. The smell of a hot breakfast greeted his senses even under the din of chatter and noise, mingling with the heavy scent of salted eggs and savory breakfast sausage, simmering on hot, oiled pans. Sweet muffins rested on the counter, still warm and slightly steaming from the oven. By all means it should have been comfortable, and yet, everything just felt wrong. Too loud, too bright, too much to be alright. He tried to ignore it as best he could though, steadying himself against the wall and shaking his head to rid himself of the odd ache in his chest and nausea that bubbled within. Pretty much all of 1A was here, shaking off sleep and chatting, in a few cases, frantically trying to compel whatever notes or homework that had been assigned over the weekend. Oh sheet! My notebook! Kaminari shouted, causing Kaken to laugh uproariously at the antics. Kaminari stood abruptly from his seat and shoved the last bite of a muffin into his mouth. He jogged quickly toward the stairs, obviously not noticing Izuku until his shoulder was slamming into the other boy's. Izuku grunted at the sharp shove. It hadn't hurt that much, but it was enough to tilt his balance back. Whoa! Kaminari gasped with a jolt, instantly twisting, moving forward to catch and steady Izuku. It wasn't necessary, Izuku having taken a slight step to avoid falling, but the blonde's hands gripped his shoulders to hold him anyway. The touch was warm, so firm it nearly burned, but not enough for Izuku to flinch away. Careful, dude, Kaminari says. He tries to smile, but it doesn't seem to sit quite right across the worry in his eyes. Stares turn to Izuku, and it's like a physical weight falls over him, smothering, hot, inescapable. You good, Midoriya? Kaminari asks, the words are far too gentle. The concern too prominent. Izuku briefly wonders if it's possible for his body to fizz up like a science fair volcano and blast his brain out through his ears. Then, Kaminari lets go, and holds up his hands a few inches from him, as if to spot Izuku, making sure he can stand on his own before really letting go. The entire world feels like the saturation and detail has been tilted up to 100, everything just a bit too in focus. Izuku can feel the stares of their classmates, having realized that Izuku was here. But Izuku's brain is too busy fighting the static electricity and overstimulation that human contact brought to think about it. Hello? Earth to Green Bean? Kaminari says, waving a hand in front of Izuku's spaced-out expression. Izuku snaps to attention like he's been shocked. Are you okay? Kaminari asks. Izuku couldn't speak, and even if he could he's sure he'd just mutter something incoherent and stupid, so he nods and shuffles forward instead. He stiffly ignores the way the tendons in his arms are twitching like they're suddenly and horribly restless. The spots where his friend's palms touched his arms pulse like day-old bruises, but more worrying, he misses it. The chatter has died to a thin flicker, but Izuku knows it's only because they're staring at him. Izuku fights against the urge to just collapse and cry. He doesn't even know why. It's just that he's tired, right? But when has one single sleepless night pushed him to such a state? So, Izuku just sits down at the edge of the breakfast bar, sliding into the seat like an alcoholic into his favorite bar stool, slugging down a tall glass of whiskey after a long day. Thoughtless, his hand finds its way to a cool glass of water, the slick cold sensation as he takes it feeling less foreign by the second as he takes grip of it. The person who handed it to him is still holding the glass, hesitating on letting go. Her hand is tepid and dainty, and Izuku barely has the energy to blink up at Yaoyorozu's concerned but patient expression before she finally lets go. Izuku thanks her for the drink before she can even speak, and he gulps it down before he has a chance to say anything stupid. He barely wonders how bad he must look to be getting such gentle treatment. He doesn't know. What he does know is that he feels pathetic. And small. And drained, oh so very drained. Ashido jumps into the chair next to him. She looks like she wants to say something, but she's hesitating. Everyone's just hesitating. It's a bad habit to have, hesitation. Hesitation gets people killed. Midoriya? You say something? Ashido asked, looking more confused than anything. Izuku blinked from where he'd been staring into his half-empty glass. Had he been muttering again? No, sorry, Izuku said, scratching awkwardly at the back of his neck and doing his best to smooth out his tired smile. I guess I mutter more when I'm tired, he said, letting out a long yawn that was only partially for show. I get that, Ashido said with a beaming grin. Something about the expression just felt easy. Completely genuine. She tilts her stool back on its back 2 legs, leaning and keeping her balance impressively well. He ignores how well he can hear the impossibly quiet creaking of the legs. Ignores how easily he can read her micro-expressions, ignores. She's off balance. Izuku seems to realize it a full second before Ashido even realizes something's wrong. He stands, his own chair screeching violently across the floor. Just the sound alone shreds at his ears. But Ashido is flailing, trying to regain balance. She barely lets out a sharp cry before she's in his arms. The chair cracks against the floor, but she's safe. Tucked to his chest like a child, lifted completely effortlessly, scooped from off her chair, free from the impact, from falling. She feels weightless. Ashido's touch burns, just like Kaminari's had, just like, he suspected, any touch would right now. But the adrenaline makes it fade sweetly into an easier haze. Izuku's heart thunders in his chest, and just for that moment, for the first time in a while, things feel okay. Saving people, the adrenaline, it's. Izuku then realizes that he's being stared at. It still bothers him, but since he knows exactly why, it's less painful. Even so, it's awkward. He looks down at the mop of pink hair, not expecting the puzzled expression that looks up at him. Izuku wants to ask if she's okay, but he doesn't trust his voice right now. So he just stands more fully and sets her down. It's awkward for a long moment. Whoa, those were some nice reflexes, Mido bro. Kirishima exclaims, pumping his fist in the air. He comes over to stand next to Izuku, clamping a hand on his friend's shoulder. Izuku fails at not going stiff at the too sharp, too warm, too much touch. But the class all sort of smile at that, and Izuku is quick to duck out from under the arm, picking up the fallen chair and scooting it into its place at the breakfast bar. Ashido is the only one who seems to realize that something isn't right, but one look in her eyes, and she's smiling. Wide and shiny and only slightly fake. He can only tell in the way her cheeks don't quite crinkle right, how her dark eyes that track him a little too tightly. Izuku takes a few steps back, away from the class, under the guise of grabbing his water, but in reality, he just hated the feeling of being in the middle of everything like that. But more eyes than just Ashido's are still on him. She seems to notice that. Oh, what a hero! She exclaims with a loud and overdramatic arm thrown across her eyes. The class laughs at that. The eyes that were on him now drifting to her overdramatic display as she throws herself over Kaken's irate and tense shoulders, beginning a long dramatic retelling of what happened, even though everyone was there for it. Predictably, as it does when you light the fuse on a stick of dynamite, or, in this case, compliment Izuku in any way while Kaken is around, things had a strong chance of blowing up. He whips around, sparks cracking in his palms like small hot thunder. He yells some sort of mockery mixed with profanity. Izuku doesn't let it reach his brain. Ashido is unbothered, she grins tighter and says something else that just sets off the blonde boy further. Just as predictably, however, Kirishima steps in. He lets out a short laugh, but the texture of his skin shifts to harden slightly, prepared to have to block a blow. Thankfully, the not quite fighting stops there. Ashido steps back a bit, letting out a hearty laugh just as Ida calls out to everyone that it was time to head to homeroom. But as Ashido grabs her bag from the counter, her shoulder brushes Izuku's. There's no accident to her stance, nor apology in her breath, and the look that greets him is one that says she wants answers. And, not for the first time in these troubling 36 hours, he wishes he had any to give. Izuku did make it to class, shuffling in the crowd just behind his classmates, lingering just slow enough to slip into the room moments before the bell rung. He rubbed at his eyes, unable to shake the glances from his friends. On the way over, Yayorozu had given him a thermos with hot chamomile tea in it, saying that it had always helped when she was feeling subpar. He'd thanked her, of course, and after her unsure expression opened to ask what was going on, he flashed the most convincing smile he could muster up, then made up some excuse to move away, busying himself with his notebook from his bag. Even without looking at their reactions directly, he could tell his demeanor didn't fit up to his usual, bright standard. And worse than that, they noticed. He took his seat and the sunny disposition fell off, clattering to the floor like a tacky, plastic mask. He decided within seconds that he really didn't have the energy to spare to fit it back on. The sensation of eyes, burning ashy holes into the back of his crumpled uniform was not by any means a new feeling. It was one that had followed him throughout his life, but it had never been a welcome sensation. Izuku flipped to one of his notes, ignoring the two prominent scent of the room, pine wood and rubber of erasers and the slight sound fresh pencil scratches that blurred with its user's loud chatter. He lifted the gifted thermos to his lips, the metal slightly warm to the touch, but the scent of the sweet tea, fresh chamomile with a spoonful of sugar and a splash of cream, was too much to even dare tasting. He figured it was too hot to drink anyway, based off the steam still writhing out through the small vent on the top of the container. Izuku looked up when he heard a familiar shuffling set of footsteps, dragging themselves down the hall with the familiar slump of someone who had not slept more than a few hours. Izuku didn't notice his friends' confused glances in his direction, flicking like a candle in soft wind, watching him, watching the door. Waiting for the other shoe to drop, that was, until their teacher entered barely seconds later. Aizawa-sensei hushed the class immediately, those not already in their seats skidding into them so sharp Izuku wondered if their sneakers would leave skid marks on the tile. But whether Aizawa-sensei was feeling kind today, or was just too tired to punish them, it didn't seem to affect anything else as the elder set up the homeroom writing with his usual slump. Thankfully, nobody seemed in the mood to cause too much trouble, even if the work was more than likely just something to do while their teacher tucked into his plush yellow sleeping bag, doing his best to catch up on even a few moments of the rest he was lacking. Izuku tamped down the aching lethargy in his own bones, and continued violently ignoring the gazes that lingered with heat, raising the hairs on his arms and the nape of his neck, even as the room went quiet. But it wasn't really quiet. Quiet didn't seem to exist anymore, not for Izuku at least. He knew because every sound felt how he'd imagine a cheese grater across his spine would, the sharp tines digging into sensitive flesh, shredding skin and flesh and nerves until he's left raw, bleeding out while surrounded by friends. But what can he do about it? What can he do about any of this? Nothing. So Izuku did what he seemed to do best these days. He pretended it was all okay, and pushed anything that disagreed with that statement to the very far back corner of his brain. People were still staring, of course. Why wouldn't they? He was sure he looked a sight, and he wasn't doing much to dissuade their concern, what with his lackluster expressions and slumped shoulders. Then again, he barely had the spare energy to stay upright for now, and, he decided, if he had to choose between reassuring his classmates, and working on whatever there was to help him become a hero, well, there really is no choice there, is there? He can reassure people later. He tamps down on the little voice in his head that says he won't. That he's drained now, and the day had only just begun. That it was all downhill from here. And so Izuku's morning passed in that slow, static haze. Every moment feeling like ticking bomb, every nerve a live wire fit to burn. Focusing on what his teachers are saying tell him made his brain ache, temples pulsing with just the effort it took to keep his eyes open as the sunshine crested and shined directly at him. The whole world was filled with so much sensation, trying to hear one voice among it was like standing in the middle of a marching band, trying to listen for one quiet flute. Izuku's wrists grew sore, his notes turning quickly from lines of text, to bulletins, to scribbles in margins that didn't even seem like language anymore. He idly wondered how well he's at least keeping up the facade, the face of the diligent student, even if his head feels like it's submerged in an ice bath. He can't really breathe, but he can make it look like his chest is rising and falling like anyone else's. After the first two PRDS are over, Izuku can hear whispers. They go quiet when he looks up from his book, from where his pencil has just been moving up and down for the past 10 minutes because each question asked felt like one he'd been asked before but the answers still evaded him. Uraraka, Todoroki and Ida caught his eye. They stood quietly, packing up for lunch no doubt, but they're huddled so close together it looks like they're planning a covert operation. Uraraka smiles at him when she notices she's been caught. The motion is far too unsure, and both Todoroki and Ida's are far too calculated. They're talking about him, he knows it. That's another thing that Izuku is used to. He swallows the bitter taste in his mouth, then, after a moment's contemplation, he grabs the thermos, screws off the cap and lets a long swig fall past his lips. It's hot, nearly singeing his tongue and throat on the way down, but the sensation, the pain, it's something to focus on. The adrenaline, even the slight amount he gets from pain, is nice. In an odd way, it calms him. He then tries to remind himself that things aren't the way they used to be. They're his friends. They're just worried. Izuku screws the cap back on the thermos, the sweetness of the tea sticking to the back of his throat. He really should say something to them. Anything to dissuade the rumor mill, hopefully before it spins out of control, like a Ferris wheel popping off its hinges and rolling toward the ocean. But Izuku can't bring himself to even stand. He sits there for 5 more minutes, his fists clenching and unclenching, breath coming out shallow, cold. He stares at the thermos, its warm metal glinting in daylight. But no matter how much he psyches himself up, he can't engage with them. Unease tears at his skin like a potato peeler attacking his wrists, strips of flesh rolling up into it, precisely slicing away at the thick skin that had saved him so many times, adding to the static energy that has been electrocuting him slowly all day. The idea that they had noticed his behavior, that they were watching him closely enough to notice when he felt off. The rational part of his brain, if there even was such a thing, reminded him that they were his friends, and they were allowed to worry. In fact, it was sweet of them to. But still. Izuku ducked his head a little tighter, tugged his notebook closer to him, but he could still feel the eyes. They weren't always the same ones, but they seemed to rotate in tandem, one leaving him, another coming to watch. He was never free. There had been a time when he'd perfected his talent of blending right into the background, disappearing in plain sight. It had been the closest thing to a quirk he'd had. And it helped immensely in his day-to-day activities, and avoiding bullies. But now he had no bullies, well, none if you didn't count Kaken, which Izuku really wasn't sure about. Now he had a real quirk, and yet, it was unnerving. To learn that he no longer had an ability that used to come as naturally as drowning, a talent he relied on for so long. Or worse, he realized idly, his pencil's short scratching snapping to a stop at even the idea that he has made such an impact that he cannot fade, that he is so important, he cannot be forgotten. Something about that thought bothered him, perhaps more than it should. Izuku had always wanted to make an impact. Being a hero is all about making impacts, but nausea rears its ugly head once more, the sticky, sick sweet of the tea clamping a grip on his throat, and Izuku is glad for the excuse of lunch to be able to rush to the bathroom, barely dodging the lanky, shadowed figure in the doorway before throwing himself into a stall and retching out his empty stomach. "Hey! Watch it!" Hitoshi barked. A perfectly reasonable response, he figured, for being nearly crushed by the bathroom door and shoved out of the way by a violently moving blur. The blur, however, rudely ignored and rocketed past him, ricocheting into the closest stall. The slightly rickety stall door slammed open on its hinges, and didn't even seem to be properly shut before the blur crashed to their knees. And maybe that's when Hitoshi should have realized that his day was about to change. All he'd really been focused on was slight bitterness at being so violently shoved, but then, curiosity, like the coiled viper it was, bit and infected him. Now, maybe it wasn't the greatest idea to follow someone who had just careened into the bathroom at such a speed. But Hitoshi wasn't thinking about that. What he was thinking about were the violent wrenching noises now emanating from the stall, its door still ajar and occupant not seeming to notice. Hitoshi muttered to himself, adjusting his shaken book bag, his feet moving, softly shuffling toward the figure before he had a chance to think, what dash? Now. Hitoshi had just been trying to have a normal day. He liked those. Because normal at UA, even in the general education course, was strange enough. Abnormal usually meant something was going terribly, terribly wrong. So, as Hitoshi looked down in the narrow stall, he realized, God, this kid just looked so small, small enough that Hitoshi didn't even really recognize him until his mop of unruly green hair tilted up, and those deep, dull, sewer green eyes turned. Not to look at him. Not even seeming to notice his existence. Just to stare blankly, hollowly, into empty space. Midoriya Izuku, star student of the hero course, wiped a sour smear of bile from his lips, dragging across a pale freckled cheek. He looked sick, violently so, which, obviously. So, yeah. Mystery solved. Mission complete. Hero student Midoriya was the one who just blew past him, and he could go now. The kid just had a little case of nausea. He'd be fine. Done and finished, right? Right? Well, only sort of. In part because Hitoshi had always been a tad too heroic for his own good. And in part because he was just stupid. So in that moment, Hitoshi had two options. Turn around and leave the hero course's shining star to vomit in peace, or as peaceful as one could get, looking like he just crawled up from his own deathbed, or, though he was painfully aware how unequipped for the task he was, try to help. Hitoshi tried, because words, much like his body, which refused to commit to either, stood still. Hitoshi just wanted to have a normal day. But before he can do anything to make that happen, the decision was made for him. The breath that escaped the star hero student's lungs, somewhere between a whimper and a sob, was unexpected at best. And Hitoshi had to take a step back and blink before he realized just how fucking bad the kid really looked. Just a little nausea? Yeah. Definitely not. Are you okay? Hitoshi asked. It wasn't original by any means, but it got across his point. And then he added, because Hitoshi had never been one to bite his tongue. You look like shit. But in true hero student fashion, the kid only seemed to notice him after the insult. Midoriya turned, slowly. But recognition sparked like embers fed dry fuel, and Midoriya seemed, in that moment, to finally realize that he's not alone. Hi, Midoriya muttered, his voice, rough and volatile and almost too quiet for Hitoshi to hear properly, only added to his sickly appearance. Are you okay? Hitoshi asked, again. He knew the answer had to be a solid no, but he had to wonder whether or not the kid would lie about it. I'm okay. Midoriya wasn't looking at him. So that answered that. The kid was a liar. Not a shocking fact, but new information nonetheless. Still, Midoriya didn't seem to be making any moves to stand up, or do much of anything really, as if afraid of jostle himself too much, like he himself was an overfilled mug he was afraid to spill. And Hitoshi wasn't making any motions to leave? It felt like an impasse. There was a long moment where neither of them moved. They weren't locked in some silent battle of wits and minds, their eyes weren't narrowed on each other like lasers, or daggers, or any other odd implements of destruction. They were just still, steady, cold. Finally, Midoriya spoke. How does your quirk work, anyway? Because yes, that's definitely the kind of question you ask to the guy you nearly bulldozed to the floor, as both of you are sitting on the floor of the bathroom during lunch. Hitoshi was, as the youth put it, uncomfy. Apparently, he was uncomfortable enough that the hero student noticed, and, surprisingly enough, offer an apology. Sorry, Midoriya said, muttering something after that, but seeming to shake himself from it. Like he was trying to find a way to justify the question, before realizing there really wasn't a way. Shinso shifted his weight uncomfortably. His shoes squeaked slightly on the tile as he twisted. His book bag heavy on his tense shoulders. The awkward silence resumed. I saw you on TV? Hitoshi muttered, trying desperately to get to more comfortable waters of conversation. He figured giving the hero in training a bit of ego time would help with that. Boy was he wrong. Instead of the pleasant smile, or even egotistical statement he'd expect from any of the hero course students, Midoriya just shut down. The light in his eyes faded slightly. Hitoshi was about to say something else, though even he was unsure what, when Midoriya shook his head, then seeming to immediately regret that, he leaned further over the toilet rim. He didn't even really retch, his body just seemed to seize and relax, going through this motion for a long moment, like a cat trying to cough up a hairball. Please, don't. Midoriya coughed into the water. He looked, well, to be gentle, he looked like sheet. And the way stared at the cool porcelain upon which his flushed face was still bowed over didn't help. And Hitoshi realized, now, more than ever, Midoriya just looked human. Don't. What? Hitoshi asked dumbly. Don't make me relive that, he groaned earnestly. Today already SCKS. Relive what? Hitoshi asked. He couldn't help it. The kid was in the hero course, gifted with a great quirk and a perfect life. Now he was getting real training, real field experience, and he was, what? Complaining? You were doing what you wanted, right? He asked, failing from making his lip upturn in a half snarl. Playing hero? Hitoshi asked, letting bitterness seep into his tone. Midoriya didn't react, at least, not the way Hitoshi expected. He was totally quiet for the moment. Even his breathing seemed to abate. I just don't want to try and glamorize that, he sighed. There was a pause, like he was deciding whether or not to say what he's thinking. To lie or be honest. Given the rawness of his tone, the earnest in his cool green eyes as he stared down and spoke, Hitoshi didn't even need his quirk to figure that he wasn't being lied to when Midoriya spoke again. I wasn't being a hero, Midoriya said, voice strangely steeled. I was pulling kids' bodies out of a wood chipper, trying not to get caught in it myself. And for the first time, but definitely not the last. Hitoshi gets the feeling he needs to seriously reevaluate his perception of Midoriya Izuku. Anyway, Hitoshi muttered, mostly because he's never been very good with words. Or apologies for that matter. Why, he wants to ask why he's here, but that feels dumb. So he settles on something that's just plain stupid. Asking the same question again. Are you okay? He can't hide the earnesty, or the awkwardness in his words. Fine. Midoriya paused, then, after a moment, something in him gives. Tired. Hitoshi let out a short laugh at that. Maybe because it's unexpected, or maybe just because of the situation. I get that, he muttered. He paused. But, usually tiredness doesn't do quite, this? He gestured to the boy's crumpled form. Yeah, Midoriya sighed, muttering to himself, something tells me sugary, hot, flavorful tea isn't the best remedy to supernatural, exhaustion-laden sensory overload. Hitoshi paused, blinking into the words he'd barely just heard. What? Midoriya looked up, blinking with surprise as if expecting that Hitoshi to have magically disappeared within the last 30 seconds, or left him to suffer, kneeling on cold tile against the porcelain bowl. Again, for not the first time since he'd met this kid, Hitoshi was seriously re-evaluating his presumptions. Sorry, Midoriya shrugged. Muttering habit. He paused, then looked down. I think, maybe, the milk in my tea was curdled. The lights above them buzzed and flickered, giving Morse code commentary on their conversation. Oh, Hitoshi muttered. Pretending to believe it. He waited another long, awkward moment. He discreetly wiped his sweaty palms off on his pants. Listen, I'm gonna get lunch dash. Midoriya said, and Hitoshi has to choke his response before it can bubble up from his throat, if only because he'd never expected the boy to be the type to swear. Midoriya doesn't seem to notice. Yeah, lunch. Sorry for keeping you dash. No, it's good, Hitoshi muttered. Not much like you had a choice in the matter, right? He paused at the slightly too steady look Midoriya gave him. Curdled milk and all. Hitoshi said, repeating the lie he definitely believed. 100%. Yeah. Still, Hitoshi scratched at the back of his neck. Do you want, should I go get recovery girl? No, the strength of his tone is oddly shocking. No. I'll be okay. Thanks though. Hitoshi paused again. Do you want me to get you anything? I doubt I'd be able to keep anything down, Midoriya said. He seemed weaker though. Maybe it was just that he was slowly stopping pretending, too tired to hold up the facade. That's fair. Hitoshi nodded. I can get you some ginger ale though? Crackers? Hitoshi tried desperately to recall anything that had given him comfort. All he could come up with were the random folk remedies he wasn't even sure worked. He'd been a pretty healthy kid, he couldn't really remember the last time he got a stomach bug. It was one of the few lotteries in life that he had gotten lucky in. Okay, Midoriya said. He didn't seem 100% sure on it either. But that was, alright. Maybe. Hitoshi didn't give himself time to dwell on it before he was turning, shoes clipping across tile, heading out of the room. Opening the bathroom door felt like waking up from a particularly vivid dream, and Hitoshi fought the urge to rub at his eyes in the light of day. He does squint though, obscuring his vision. For the second time today, someone slams into his shoulder. He's jostled enough that he nearly trips. A hand taps him and Hitoshi feels weightless. Sorry. The female voice exclaimed, immediately coming to steady him. Releasing him from her quirk quickly. Are you alright? I wasn't paying attention, I'm sorry. Her words are fast, and Hitoshi barely has time to recognize her. Uraraka, also hero course. Man, he just couldn't escape them, could he? It's fine. Hitoshi's words are clipped, he's well aware he's not being overly kind right now, but he's still a man on a mission. He tugs his bag up his shoulder again from where it had slipped. Alright. Sorry again. She bowed slightly before rushing off, away from the cafeteria. Which Hitoshi found kind of odd. Maybe it had to do with the phone she was holding tight, anxiously pressed up to her ear. Her lips pressed into a thin line, she was worried. Hitoshi's feet hesitated for a moment, before turning toward the cafeteria. He'd figure out what was going on with that later. First, ginger ale and crackers. Hey! Watch it! Hitoshi barked. A perfectly reasonable response, he figured, for being nearly crushed by the bathroom door and shoved out of the way by a violently moving blur. The blur, however, rudely ignored and rocketed past him, ricocheting into the closest stall. The slightly rickety stall door slammed open on its hinges, and didn't even seem to be properly shut before the blur crashed to their knees. And maybe that's when Hitoshi should have realized that his day was about to change. All he'd really been focused on was slight bitterness at being so violently shoved, but then, curiosity, like the coiled viper it was, bit and infected him. Now, maybe it wasn't the greatest idea to follow someone who had just careened into the bathroom at such a speed. But Hitoshi wasn't thinking about that. What he was thinking about were the violent wrenching noises now emanating from the stall, its door still ajar and occupant not seeming to notice. Hitoshi muttered to himself, adjusting his shaken book bag, his feet moving, softly shuffling toward the figure before he had a chance to think, what dash? Now. Hitoshi had just been trying to have a normal day. He liked those. Because normal at UA, even in the general education course, was strange enough. Abnormal usually meant something was going terribly, terribly wrong. So, as Hitoshi looked down in the narrow stall, he realized, God, this kid just looked so small, small enough that Hitoshi didn't even really recognize him until his mop of unruly green hair tilted up, and those deep, dull, sewer green eyes turned. Not to look at him. Not even seeming to notice his existence. Just to stare blankly, hollowly, into empty space. Midoriya Izuku, star student of the hero course, wiped a sour smear of bile from his lips, dragging across a pale freckled cheek. He looked sick, violently so, which, obviously. So, yeah. Mystery solved. Mission complete. Hero student Midoriya was the one who just blew past him, and he could go now. The kid just had a little case of nausea. He'd be fine. Done and finished, right? Right? Well, only sort of. In part because Hitoshi had always been a tad too heroic for his own good. And in part because he was just stupid. So in that moment, Hitoshi had two options. Turn around and leave the hero course's shining star to vomit in peace, or as peaceful as one could get, looking like he just crawled up from his own deathbed, or, though he was painfully aware how unequipped for the task he was, try to help. Hitoshi tried, because words, much like his body, which refused to commit to either, stood still. Hitoshi just wanted to have a normal day. But before he can do anything to make that happen, the decision was made for him. The breath that escaped the star hero student's lungs, somewhere between a whimper and a sob, was unexpected at best. And Hitoshi had to take a step back and blink before he realized just how fucking bad the kid really looked. Just a little nausea? Yeah. Definitely not. Are you okay? Hitoshi asked. It wasn't original by any means, but it got across his point. And then he added, because Hitoshi had never been one to bite his tongue. You look like shit. But in true hero student fashion, the kid only seemed to notice him after the insult. Midoriya turned, slowly. But recognition sparked like embers fed dry fuel, and Midoriya seemed, in that moment, to finally realize that he's not alone. Hi, Midoriya muttered, his voice, rough and volatile and almost too quiet for Hitoshi to hear properly, only added to his sickly appearance. Are you okay? Hitoshi asked, again. He knew the answer had to be a solid no, but he had to wonder whether or not the kid would lie about it. I'm okay. Midoriya wasn't looking at him. So that answered that. The kid was a liar. Not a shocking fact, but new information nonetheless. Still, Midoriya didn't seem to be making any moves to stand up, or do much of anything really, as if afraid of jostle himself too much, like he himself was an overfilled mug he was afraid to spill. And Hitoshi wasn't making any motions to leave? It felt like an impasse. There was a long moment where neither of them moved. They weren't locked in some silent battle of wits and minds, their eyes weren't narrowed on each other like lasers, or daggers, or any other odd implements of destruction. They were just still, steady, cold. Finally, Midoriya spoke. How does your quirk work, anyway? Because yes, that's definitely the kind of question you ask to the guy you nearly bulldozed to the floor, as both of you are sitting on the floor of the bathroom during lunch. Hitoshi was, as the youth put it, uncomfy. Apparently, he was uncomfortable enough that the hero student noticed, and, surprisingly enough, offer an apology. Sorry, Midoriya said, muttering something after that, but seeming to shake himself from it. Like he was trying to find a way to justify the question, before realizing there really wasn't a way. Shinso shifted his weight uncomfortably. His shoes squeaked slightly on the tile as he twisted. His book bag heavy on his tense shoulders. The awkward silence resumed. I saw you on TV? Hitoshi muttered, trying desperately to get to more comfortable waters of conversation. He figured giving the hero in training a bit of ego time would help with that. Boy was he wrong. Instead of the pleasant smile, or even egotistical statement he'd expect from any of the hero course students, Midoriya just shut down. The light in his eyes faded slightly. Hitoshi was about to say something else, though even he was unsure what, when Midoriya shook his head, then seeming to immediately regret that, he leaned further over the toilet rim. He didn't even really retch, his body just seemed to seize and relax, going through this motion for a long moment, like a cat trying to cough up a hairball. Please, don't. Midoriya coughed into the water. He looked, well, to be gentle, he looked like sheet. And the way stared at the cool porcelain upon which his flushed face was still bowed over didn't help. And Hitoshi realized, now, more than ever, Midoriya just looked human. Don't. What? Hitoshi asked dumbly. Don't make me relive that, he groaned earnestly. Today already SCKS. Relive what? Hitoshi asked. He couldn't help it. The kid was in the hero course, gifted with a great quirk and a perfect life. Now he was getting real training, real field experience, and he was, what? Complaining? You were doing what you wanted, right? He asked, failing from making his lip upturn in a half snarl. Playing hero? Hitoshi asked, letting bitterness seep into his tone. Midoriya didn't react, at least, not the way Hitoshi expected. He was totally quiet for the moment. Even his breathing seemed to abate. I just don't want to try and glamorize that, he sighed. There was a pause, like he was deciding whether or not to say what he's thinking. To lie or be honest. Given the rawness of his tone, the earnest in his cool green eyes as he stared down and spoke, Hitoshi didn't even need his quirk to figure that he wasn't being lied to when Midoriya spoke again. I wasn't being a hero, Midoriya said, voice strangely steeled. I was pulling kids' bodies out of a woodchipper, trying not to get caught in it myself. And for the first time, but definitely not the last. Hitoshi gets the feeling he needs to seriously re-evaluate his perception of Midoriya Izuku. Anyway, Hitoshi muttered, mostly because he's never been very good with words. Or apologies for that matter. Why, he wants to ask why he's here, but that feels dumb. So he settles on something that's just plain stupid. Asking the same question again. Are you okay? He can't hide the earnesty, or the awkwardness in his words. Fine. Midoriya paused, then, after a moment, something in him gives. Tired. Hitoshi let out a short laugh at that. Maybe because it's unexpected, or maybe just because of the situation. I get that, he muttered. He paused. But, usually tiredness doesn't do quite, this? He gestured to the boy's crumpled form. Yeah, Midoriya sighed, muttering to himself, something tells me sugary, hot, flavorful tea isn't the best remedy to supernatural, exhaustion-laden sensory overload. Hitoshi paused, blinking into the words he'd barely just heard. What? Midoriya looked up, blinking with surprise as if expecting that Hitoshi to have magically disappeared within the last 30 seconds, or left him to suffer, kneeling on cold tile against the porcelain bowl. Again, for not the first time since he'd met this kid, Hitoshi was seriously re-evaluating his presumptions. Sorry, Midoriya shrugged. Muttering habit. He paused, then looked down. I think, maybe, the milk in my tea was curdled. The lights above them buzzed and flickered, giving Morse code commentary on their conversation. Oh. Hitoshi muttered. Pretending to believe it. He waited another long, awkward moment. He discreetly wiped his sweaty palms off on his pants. Listen, I'm gonna get lunch dash. Midoriya said, and Hitoshi has to choke his response before it can bubble up from his throat, if only because he'd never expected the boy to be the type to swear. Midoriya doesn't seem to notice. Yeah, lunch. Sorry for keeping you dash. No, it's good, Hitoshi muttered. Not much like you had a choice in the matter, right? He paused at the slightly too steady look Midoriya gave him. Curdled milk and all. Hitoshi said, repeating the lie he definitely believed. 100%. Yeah. Still, Hitoshi scratched at the back of his neck. Do you want, should I go get recovery girl? No, the strength of his tone is oddly shocking. No. I'll be okay. Thanks though. Hitoshi paused again. Do you want me to get you anything? I doubt I'd be able to keep anything down, Midoriya said. He seemed weaker though. Maybe it was just that he was slowly stopping pretending, too tired to hold up the facade. That's fair. Hitoshi nodded. I can get you some ginger ale though? Crackers? Hitoshi tried desperately to recall anything that had given him comfort. All he could come up with were the random folk remedies he wasn't even sure worked. He'd been a pretty healthy kid, he couldn't really remember the last time he got a stomach bug. It was one of the few lotteries in life that he had gotten lucky in. Okay, Midoriya said. He didn't seem 100% sure on it either. But that was, alright. Maybe. Hitoshi didn't give himself time to dwell on it before he was turning, shoes clipping across tile, heading out of the room. Opening the bathroom door felt like waking up from a particularly vivid dream, and Hitoshi fought the urge to rub at his eyes in the light of day. He does squint though, obscuring his vision. For the second time today, someone slams into his shoulder. He's jostled enough that he nearly trips. A hand taps him and Hitoshi feels weightless. Sorry. the female voice exclaimed, immediately coming to steady him. Releasing him from her quirk quickly. Are you alright? I wasn't paying attention, I'm sorry. Her words are fast, and Hitoshi barely has time to recognize her. Uraraka, also hero course. Man, he just couldn't escape them, could he? It's fine. Hitoshi's words are clipped, he's well aware he's not being overly kind right now, but he's still a man on a mission. He tugs his bag up his shoulder again from where it had slipped. Alright. Sorry again. She bowed slightly before rushing off, away from the cafeteria. Which Hitoshi found kind of odd. Maybe it had to do with the phone she was holding tight, anxiously pressed up to her ear. Her lips pressed into a thin line, she was worried. Hitoshi's feet hesitated for a moment, before turning toward the cafeteria. He'd figure out what was going on with that later. First, ginger ale and crackers. Chapter 14. Izuku had been given his phone by All Might earlier that day. Apparently he'd left it at home during everything. In that moment, he'd been thankful to have it back. But now? He wished he'd left without it. Because someone's calling him again. Izuku can feel it as his phone buzzes in his pocket, but the vibration of the call just makes him feel more sick, so he silences it. He can feel the wave of sensation increasing again, he can hear the echoes of chatter through the walls and floors, he can't focus on any of it. Talking to Shinso had helped, somehow. He wasn't quite sure why. Maybe just because it was something to do, to focus on. But now, he's gone. Someone's talking about him in a classroom. Someone's on the phone in the courtyard. He can hear it all. Another person is screaming and laughing out in the field. Someone's yelling at their friend in the lunchroom for telling a dumb joke and someone's snoring from the teacher's lounge. Izuku can still hear his phone ringing. He checks again that it's off, and it is. But it's not just his phone when he looks up, the stall walls are buzzing now, vibrating like the whole world is the tail of an angry rattlesnake. He knows it's a warning, but he doesn't know of what. His heart pounds. He needs to get out of here. Izuku clambers up from where he'd been draped across the toilet seat, sweaty hands slick against cold tile as he dares to stand, but the entire world feels loud and full. Every bit of the endless emptiness, now crammed to bursting. He feels like he's splitting open, like he's outgrowing his skin. Everything hurts again. This is the most he's felt in his life and the sheer sensory overload of it is frying his nerves. His fingers tingle. His face burns, his tongue feels like it's swelling in his mouth, everything feels hot. Izuku stumbles over to one of the sinks. The nausea is no longer his biggest problem, but his surroundings are starting to blur, and blinking doesn't help. Each piece of the world bleeds into the next, until every familiar sharp line and curve of tile floor and beige walls vanish. There's no detail, and yet there's too much going on. Unfocused yet completely crisp. The faucet squeaks as he turns it on and splashes some water on his face. For a split second he's worried that he'll dissolve under the moisture, that he'll start dripping into a soupy mess which swirls down the drain until he disappears altogether. His stomach twists again. He turns the faucet off. The world is too bright. His teeth ache in rhythm with his pulse, still flooding his ears. He's still so tired. Izuku's weak knees buckle. He barely remembers to use his arms to soften the fall. His breathing is unsteady. His heartbeat continues to spike. He crawls across the dirty floor, and folds himself under the sink, pressing hard into the corner. Stupidly hoping that if he could just find a corner dark enough, a space quiet enough, he could hide from it all. But tucking his head between his arms only makes his ears warm, so he presses on his eyes until he can only see black. His heart is beating jackrabbit fast in his chest, like it's trying to outrun the rest of him. There's a burning, just behind his sternum. And with nothing left to do, Izuku closes his eyes and weeps. Submitting to the inescapable, relentless pounding of blood in his ears. Izuku isn't sure when he falls asleep, only that, when he wakes up, the world is white. It doesn't hurt as much this time. The thought isn't his, but it skips like a record and scratches him to a halt. Familiar. Izuku's not quite sure what that thought means. Why he expected something to hurt, even though there is nothing here. That's another thought that startles him, as Izuku sits up, and tries to stand. But he quickly finds that there's no floor to push against. He was falling, and standing. There was no wind at his back, no gravity to pull him down. He was floating, and falling. There was something in front of him. He can't see it, or sense it. He shouldn't be able to tell it's there, really. It didn't smell like anything, or buzz with any particular sound. He just knows it's there. And it didn't seem harmful. So he reaches out. Hesitant at first, but as soon as his hand touches the outer casing, the sensation rippling and humming at his touch like a thin layer of water atop a sheet of ice, it starts to glow. A soft, pulsating glow that felt, oddly like a heartbeat, like something much, much larger than him. Asleep, breathing. It calms him. He feels better. Izuku blinks, and it's gone. But his hand isn't empty. Someone was holding it. Smiling. Fond. Kind. A sweet shadow that quickly gains form and shape. The touch doesn't burn. It doesn't hurt. Izuku nearly chokes on his tears because of it. It doesn't hurt, and neither do their words when they speak, though he can't really decipher what they were saying. All he could tell was that, there were people here, and they were kind. And he felt safe, so very safe and taken care of. A woman tugs him into her arms, and he pulls her as tight as he reasonably can, and then a little bit tighter than that. And Izuku sobs. It takes a long time before he can really do much more than cry. But Shimura, he doesn't really remember why he knows her name, but it fits her so well he can't stop, just rubs patiently at his back, hushing him through his tears, even as they slow. How are you feeling? Shimura asks gently, as his tears and hiccups fade enough for him to breathe more evenly. Her care is so tender, and the hollow feeling that's been haunting his chest finally softens. It feels good enough that he could cry all over again. But there's more important things to tend to. Most notably, the person he's been crying on this whole time. He doesn't look up to meet her eyes. Sorry, Izuku mutters. Our first meeting shouldn't be me, crying all over you dash. Kid, it's okay, she assures immediately. Besides, we already met, remember? She asks. After a long moment, Izuku nods. If anyone made a bad impression, it was us, a male voice says, the silver-haired man says. He's sitting cross-legged, like he's trying not to take up space, which feels mildly silly given the visible infinity of white space they have. Still, the small group of people huddle and keep close, even silent, there's care in their eyes. And a varying, yet non-negligible sense of guilt. Yeah, nearly choking to death can't be a great first impression, Django says, obviously trying to break the tension. I've had worse, Izuku mutters, laughing slightly. Doing his best to add to the levity. It doesn't really work, so he just kept going. He's always been good at rambling, after all. And I mean, it is kinda a proper introduction to who I am. Izuku says, wiping at his eyes and pulling away a little further from Shimura, even though he doesn't really want to. She keeps a hand on his shoulder. In case you haven't noticed. I kinda cry a lot, Izuku says. He shrugs, and giggles to himself. Another tear slips down his cheek. DMN, he really is a crybaby. Meeting all sorts of amazing old heroes and all he can do is cry. Being in touch with your emotions is nothing to be ashamed of, kiddo, Shimura says. Yeah, some of us could use a little more emotional, another man grunted, turning to the one who just elbowed him. Hey! Talk sheet, get hit. The Django justifies. Izuku lets out a short laugh at that. Speaking of talking though, another man says, waiting. Patient. The man is stiff for a moment, but sighs and concedes soon after. Right. He nods, and he moves toward Izuku. He's on the thinner side, with shaggy, pale hair and a line of scar tissue across his face. I'm sorry. He says, blunt and abrupt, like he's not used to the words. Izuku mutters. He's about to ask why he's apologizing before the man continues. We were trying to figure out exactly how to, help you, he says, as if it can be assumed he knows anything at all. Ever. How to get you used to the idea of having more than one quirk, he says. He blinks. More than one, quirk? We tried it before, Shimura admits gently, during the attack at that junior high, but the sudden influx of power didn't seem to work all that well, and she pauses, trying to find the words. You kinda just gave up the reins, so to speak, Django says. Several people nod. That's why you can't remember the attack. We were kind of trying to help. Wait, but how did you know I needed the quirks? Izuku asks, his brain running a mile a minute. And can a person even have more than one quirk at a time? Does that make me some kind of Nomu? Am I dash? Breathe, Midoriya, Shimura reminds gently from beside him. And he realizes he is somewhat hyperventilating. She leads him in a long, deep breath. One question at a time, she says, we have time, now. Izuku nods. He swallows. His throat feels slightly rough. Okay. How about, he thinks for a moment. He wants to make his questions count. How did this start? He asks. The users all sort of raise an eyebrow, or tilt their head. So he pauses to clarify. I mean, All Might only had the one quirk, right? He didn't have access to all of them. Shimura nods immediately. Izuku gets the vague feeling that she may have known All Might. Or at least watched over him a little. So, Izuku wonders, why do I have that? A few of them look between themselves, then shrug. Very helpful. The one thing we know for certain is One for All reacted to your distress, a white-haired man says. His voice is quiet and settled. Izuku still feels a bit odd, looking at him. It feels like looking at himself. A few of them share a look as he says, distressed too. There's something there that's going unsaid. We don't really know if you reached for our quirks, or if we offered them. Or maybe we met somewhere in the middle. But either way, you've got them now. The scar-faced man says. He looks more than a little bitter about it. Oh, Izuku says. He feels kind of underwhelmed. Yeah. Sorry if that ain't as dramatic as you were hoping, Django says. Anything else you want to ask? Izuku nods immediately. He wants to ask so much. About each of the users' lives, about their experiences as heroes, about their journeys and their quirks and how they used their quirks to fight evil. But one look at Shimura clicks his jaw shut. Right. One question at a time. Izuku nods, slowly. So, can I just access your quirks at any time? Izuku asks. It feels like a practical question. Well, sort of. The scarred man says. He looks around, and the rest nod along. There definitely seem to be side effects though. And we're not really sure about those either, the silver-haired man says slowly. We're learning just like you are. And, the scarred man says again, we don't wanna, just, up and memory wipe you if you get in a bad situation again, the woman says. More like when, Django laughs. But we had a chat, and we figured offering our quirks, one by one, would be best, right? The woman says, it'll get you used to the new feeling, before slowly progressing to the next. Izuku nods. Intent and wondering if that had something to do with, pretty much all of that day. So, we tried to choose the one that would be least disruptive, Shimura adds. One that you could easily explain away if you needed to. So there's no problems with the secret of one for all. Izuku nods. So eventually, Django says, we chose Dash. Third, the scarred says, like a greeting. Like it's his name. Then quickly shooting Django a look. With a clenched jaw and a glare. We agreed on my quirk. Just as we also agreed on not using names, he says. We should probably introduce ourselves. By the way, someone speaks up from behind them. A man with dark hair in a high-collared jacket, a bit like Best Jeanist. We will, sixth. But we should let third finish apologizing first, the white-haired man says slowly. There's almost a warning in his tone. Third looks back at him, jaw clenched, and Izuku blinks. I suppose my quirk is somewhat to blame for your rough day. He rubs at the back of his neck again. I don't think anyone realized that you wouldn't know how to shut it off. So, he pauses, seeming to physically swallow a grimace. Sorry. He wants to tell the man not to worry about it. He wants to tell him it's okay, and not to bother apologizing, to him of all people. He wants to tell the man it really wasn't that bad. But they've all presumably been in his head for most of this. So he's not sure how well that lie would go over. Instead, he just sort of swallows and nods. So, what you mean is I've been feeling terrible all day because I have another quirk? And it's just, on? Constantly? Yeah, basically. That's really cool. Izuku says. He grins. After a dumbfounded second, Django laughs along. He claps him on the shoulder, his smile bright. You're a weird kid, he says it like a compliment, so he leans into the praise. In front of him, Third rolls his eyes. Can I ask though, he pauses, for a second realizing how many questions he's been asking, how annoying it might be. But they're just looking at him expectantly. So he continues. What does your quirk do? It's called Danger Sense, the man says, in the tone of a lecturer. My quirk detects any potential threats in the surrounding area, thus giving the user the opportunity to properly react to them quickly, similar to a sixth sense. He explains. Izuku's eyes go starry. That's so useful. He exclaims. It's probably the most subtle of all our quirks too, the dark-haired man says. I mean, not that OFA isn't already flashy as hell. But I think suddenly having black whips flinging out around you, he gestures to Django, or flying, like this one dash, he jabs his thumb toward Shimura, who lets out a short laugh. You can fly? Izuku says, twisting suddenly, looking up at her with sparkling eyes. Shimura laughs. I mean, I could, she says, but her smile never faces. But you can. And that just sparks off a whole new flurry of joy in him. Because while there's so many options with flight, was it just self-levitation, like floating? If so, could it be exercised and shifted toward objects to lift them easier? Or was it propulsion-based, where it could also then be used to move faster? Would it make things he was carrying weightless too? Could he? You can try it later if you want, Shimura says, smiling obviously as Izuku realizes he was muttering again. Izuku flushes slightly. When you wake up that is, she says. Oh yeah, Izuku says, blinking. I should do that, shouldn't I? The group laughs, and Izuku's chest feels lighter. I mean, maybe, the dark-haired man says with a chuckle. Time does work a little different here, but I'm sure your friends are worried. Izuku nods. and closes his eyes. It feels instinctual, like falling asleep, but backwards. He feels an odd tugging sensation in his chest, and then, wait, he says. And the tugging is gone immediately. He blinks his eyes open, and they're all still there. A little fuzzy though, but that clears within seconds. Before I wake up? I feel like I should learn how to, turn off and on, third's quirk? Django facepalms, calling out a loud duh to himself, before grabbing Izuku's hand. The small crowd laughs. Shimura just grins. Okay, let's get started. Third says. And so it begins.
Okay, sadly the chapter is over. And if you enjoyed the video, just leave a like and subscribe with post notification. So when the next chapter is ready, you will be notified. Okay, see you in the next video. Bye.